Chapter 1. The Forbidden Section's Secret. The ancient book was warm to the touch. Hermione paused, her fingers still pressed against the leather binding, feeling the unexpected heat that seemed to pulse beneath her palm like a sleeping heartbeat. She had pulled dozens of volumes from these shelves over the past weeks, each one promising answers about basilisks that never materialized, but none of them had felt alive. Serpentine curses and their historical applications, she whispered, reading the faded gilt lettering. The title meant nothing to her. She had been searching for anything related to giant serpents, petrification, or ancient magical creatures. What caught her attention was how the book had been shelved, wedged sideways between two massive tomes on dark arts theory, as if someone had hastily shoved it there and hoped it would be forgotten. It was nearly midnight. The restricted section of the library stretched around her in pools of wand-light, empty and echoing. She had grown comfortable with these late-night research sessions since Halloween, when Mrs. Norris had been found petrified and the words about the Chamber of Secrets had appeared on the corridor wall. While Harry and Ron worried about attacks and suspected students, Hermione buried herself in books. Someone had opened the Chamber of Secrets, and somewhere in these endless shelves lay the key to understanding what kind of creature could petrify without killing. The warmth in the book seemed to intensify under her touch. She opened it carefully, expecting pages about snake-related curses, and instead found herself staring at handwritten notes in a script she didn't recognize. The Grindelwald matter grows more pressing. A insists the sacrifice of the Morrison boy was necessary. 3 dead is better than 300, he says. I cannot argue with the mathematics, but the boy's eyes haunt me. Hermione's breath caught. The ink looked fresh despite the book's aged appearance, as if the words had been written yesterday. She turned the page, her heart beginning to pound. Today marks the 6th child lost to our greater good. Eliza Hartwell, age 11, died when I failed to warn the ministry about the cursed artifacts in her family's shop. A reminds me that her death provided crucial intelligence about Grindelwald's methods. He is not wrong. Her sacrifice may save dozens, but her parents do not know their daughter died for strategy, and I cannot bear to see gratitude in their eyes when they thank me for my attempts to save her. The handwriting grew more familiar as Hermione stared at it. She had seen this script before, on assignment feedback, on official school notices. Her hands began to shake. I tell myself that leadership requires these impossible choices, that someone must bear the weight of deciding who lives and dies. A says I am suited for such burdens, that my intelligence and foresight make me uniquely capable of calculating which losses serve the greater good. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps this is what it means to be responsible for more than oneself. But the signature at the bottom of the entry left no room for doubt. A PWB to Dumbledore. Hermione snapped the book shut so quickly that several nearby volumes trembled on their shelves. The warmth in the leather binding now felt burning hot against her palms. She set it down carefully, as if it might explode, and took several steps backward. This couldn't be real. Someone was playing an elaborate trick, a cruel joke designed to upset students, already terrified by the chamber attacks. Professor Dumbledore would never. He was the greatest wizard of their time, the man who had defeated Grindelwald, who had welcomed her to Hogwarts, who stood as a beacon of wisdom and kindness in a world that often seemed hostile to muggle-born witches like herself. But even as she tried to rationalize it away, her methodical mind began cataloguing details. The handwriting matched perfectly. The paper felt genuinely aged, or not artificially treated. The magical signature of the book, that warm, pulsing energy, felt distinctly like the magic that permeated Dumbledore's office, the same gentle power that always made her feel safe in his presence. She opened the book again, telling herself she would find some evidence of forgery, some detail that would prove this was all an elaborate deception. The next entry was dated 3 months later. Today I watched young Thomas Whitmore die and did nothing to prevent it. The curse could have been lifted. I knew the counter-incantation, but his death served as the final proof we needed of Grindelwald's new methods. Sometimes I wonder if A's influence has made me monstrous, or if the monster was always within me, waiting for sufficient justification to emerge. The boy's sister came to me afterward, weeping. She begged me to explain why such a brilliant wizard as myself couldn't save her brother. I told her some magics are beyond even my abilities. The lie came so easily that it frightened me. 10 children now. I have their names written on a piece of parchment in my desk drawer. I tell myself I honor them by remembering, but perhaps I am only torturing myself. A says guilt is a luxury we cannot afford during wartime. He may be right about that as well. Hermione's legs felt weak. She sank into the nearest chair, the book still open in her lap. The entries continued, page after page, chronicling years of calculated deaths. Children who could have been saved but weren't. Families who could have been warned but remained ignorant. All in service of some grand strategy against Grindelwald that required sacrifices to be made in shadows. Her mind reeled as the implications crashed over her. If this was real, and every instinct told her it was, then the kindly headmaster she admired was also someone who had looked children in the eyes and chosen to let them die. Someone who had built his reputation as a great wizard, partly on the bones of those he had deemed expendable. The book seemed to pulse warmer in her hands, as if responding to her distress. She turned another page, hoping desperately to find something that would make sense of this nightmare. I have made my choice regarding the Potter boy. When the prophecy is fulfilled, and it will be, whether I guide events or not, I will ensure he survives long enough to fulfill his purpose. The sacrifice will be enormous, but necessary. He will lose everything, suffer in ways that would break most adults, but he will live until the moment comes when his death can serve the greatest good. I am sorry, James. I am sorry, Lily. Your son will pay the price for my calculations, just as so many children have before him. The book fell from Hermione's nerveless fingers, hitting the stone floor with a sound like thunder in the quiet library. She stared at the closed volume, her mind struggling to process what she had just read. Harry. The entry was about Harry. Professor Dumbledore knew something terrible was going to happen to Harry Potter, had known, perhaps, since Harry was a baby, and rather than prevent it, he was planning to use it. Just like all the other children whose names were written in his secret records. Hermione buried her face in her hands, feeling 13 years of faith and admiration crumble around her. At the headmaster who had welcomed her to this magical world, who had made her feel valued and protected, was the same man who wrote clinical notes about letting children die for strategic advantage. When she finally lifted her head, she noticed something she had missed in her shock. The book had fallen open to a different page, revealing what looked like a hand-drawn map of Hogwarts. But this map showed passages and rooms that didn't appear on any official floor plans. Hidden chambers, secret corridors, and in the deepest part of the castle, marked with a small skull symbol, a room labelled simply the Archive. Below the map, in Dumbledore's now familiar script, was a single line. Where I keep their names, so I may never forget the cost of my choices. Hermione reached for the book with trembling hands. If there were more children, if this was just the beginning of what Dumbledore had hidden, then she needed to know. Whatever the cost to her own peace of mind, those forgotten victims deserved someone to remember their stories. The book was cold now, its strange warmth extinguished the moment she had seen Harry's name. But as she lifted it from the floor, she could have sworn she heard something like whispers echoing from the pages, the voices of children crying out to be heard. Chapter 2. The Names on the Wall. Hermione returned the next night with a quill, parchment, and a heart full of dread. She had spent the entire day in a fog, mechanically taking notes during transfiguration, while her mind churned through what she had read. Professor McGonagall's lesson on vanishing spells seemed absurdly trivial compared to the weight of Dumbledore's journal entries, and when Harry asked her if she was feeling all right after she failed to answer a direct question about homework, she had mumbled something about not sleeping well. It wasn't entirely a lie. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those clinical notes about calculated deaths, about children sacrificed for strategic advantage. She had tried to convince herself it was all an elaborate hoax, but her methodical mind kept returning to the details that rang true: the handwriting, the magical signature of the book, the specific references to historical events she could verify. Now, sitting in the restricted section with the warm book open before her, she began the grim work of cataloguing the evidence. The first thing she discovered was that the journal entries were only the beginning. Behind the handwritten pages lay something that made her stomach clench with recognition. A section of the book that had been magically expanded, its pages multiplying far beyond what the physical binding should have been able to contain. She had seen similar magic in her copy of Magical Theory, spells that allowed texts to hold far more information than their apparent size suggested. But this expanded section didn't contain more journal entries. Instead, she found herself looking at what could only be described as a memorial wall made of parchment. Names. Hundreds of them, arranged in neat columns with dates, ages, and brief descriptions of how each person had died. Her hands shook as she began to read, taking notes on a separate piece of parchment with mechanical precision. Sarah Bones, age 9, died November 15th, 1943. Removed protective wards around family home to allow Death Eater infiltration. Intelligence gained prevented larger massacre. Marcus Longbottom, age 12, died February 3rd, 1945. Allowed cursed artifact to remain in family vault. Death provided crucial information about Grindelwald's new methods. Jennifer Prewett, age 8, died August 19th, 1946. Failed to warn family of impending attack. Strategic necessity. Warning would have compromised network of informants. The dates made her pause. These deaths had occurred during Dumbledore's war against Grindelwald, spanning years when he had been building his reputation as a great leader of the light. She recognized some of the surnames: Bones, Longbottom, Prewett. These were established wizarding families, people whose descendants she knew or had heard of. As she continued reading, copying names and details with trembling hands, a horrifying pattern emerged. Each death had been preventable. Each had been allowed to happen because Dumbledore calculated that the strategic benefit outweighed the cost of a single life. And then she found a name that made her breath catch in her throat. Myrtle Elizabeth Warren, age 14, died June 13th, 1943. Ravenclaw student. Death by basilisk during Tom Riddle's opening of the Chamber of Secrets. Could have prevented by revealing Tom's true nature to faculty. Chose not to intervene. Boy's continued access to chamber provided valuable intelligence about Slytherin's monster and methods of control. Or subject's death unfortunate but acceptable loss. Hermione stared at the entry, her mind reeling. She knew Myrtle. Everyone at Hogwarts knew Moaning Myrtle, the ghost who haunted the second-floor girls' bathroom. She had always assumed Myrtle's death 50 years ago was simply a tragedy, an unavoidable consequence of the chamber being opened by Tom Riddle. But this entry suggested something far more sinister. Dumbledore had known Tom Riddle was responsible, had known and chosen not to stop him because watching the chamber's opening provided valuable intelligence. Myrtle had died because Dumbledore wanted to learn more about the basilisk. Her quill moved almost without conscious direction, copying the entry word for word. She needed proof of this, needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But the methodical part of her mind, the part that had made her the best student in her year, demanded documentation. She turned the page and found more familiar names, deaths from more recent years. Peter Pettigrew, age 21, died October 31st, 1981. Staged death to maintain deep cover as Death Eater spy. Actual survival unknown to wider order. Strategic value of believed dead agent too valuable to compromise with truth. That entry was marked with an addendum in different ink. Note: agent's true allegiance remains uncertain. Possible triple agent. Death of Potter parents may have been his work. Strategic gamble appears to have failed. Recommend termination if ever located. Hermione's blood ran cold. Peter Pettigrew, Harry's father's friend, the man supposedly killed by Sirius Black. According to this record, Dumbledore knew Pettigrew might be alive and might have betrayed the Potters. Had known for 11 years. Did that mean Sirius Black was innocent? She forced herself to keep reading, to keep taking notes, even as her worldview crumbled around her. There were dozens more entries, spanning decades of calculated decisions. Students who could have been warned about cursed objects, but weren't. Families who could have received protection, but were left vulnerable because their deaths served a greater strategic purpose. And running through it all, like a poisonous thread, was the phrase that had clearly become Dumbledore's guiding principle. For the greater good. She had heard him use those words before, in speeches to students about making difficult choices and standing up to dark wizards. They had always sounded noble, inspiring. Now they felt like a euphemism for murder. When she reached the end of the memorial wall, she counted her notes. 147 names. 147 people who had died, not because they had to, but because Albus Dumbledore had calculated that their deaths served his purposes. The book remained warm in her lap, as if responding to her growing horror. She turned to a new section and found something that made her heart stop entirely. A separate list, labeled Current Strategic Assets. And there, third from the top, was a name she recognized. Harry James Potter, age 12. Prophesied to defeat Dark Lord. Must remain alive until final confrontation, but should not be made aware of true nature of destiny. I'd recommend continued placement in emotionally neglectful environment. Suffering builds character necessary for ultimate sacrifice. Monitor closely, but avoid direct intervention unless absolutely necessary for survival. Below that, in newer ink. Note: subject's tendency toward hero complex developing as predicted. Recent chamber incident confirms willingness to risk life for others. Character development on schedule for required self-sacrifice in final phase. Hermione's quill fell from nerveless fingers, splattering ink across her notes. The implication was unmistakable. Harry wasn't just another student to Dumbledore. He was a strategic asset, being carefully managed toward some ultimate sacrifice. Everything she thought she knew about Harry's life, his placement with the Dursleys, his struggles, and even his current adventures, it was all part of a deliberate plan to shape him into someone willing to die when the time came. She had to close the book, had to stop reading before the weight of these revelations crushed her entirely. But even as she shut the cover, her mind was already racing ahead to the logical implications. If Dumbledore had detailed records of 147 deaths he had allowed or orchestrated, then where were the bodies buried? Where were the evidence and artifacts that would prove these children had lived and died? The memorial wall suggested a level of documentation that went beyond simple journal entries. Her eyes fell on the map she had glimpsed the night before, the one showing the hidden room marked the Archive. If Dumbledore kept physical evidence of his strategic sacrifices, that was where she would find it. She gathered her notes, her hands still shaking. Tomorrow she would figure out how to reach that hidden room. Tonight, she needed to process what she had learned and decide what to do with the most dangerous knowledge she had ever possessed. As she prepared to leave, she glanced once more at the memorial wall. 147 names. 147 children and young people whose lives had been deemed expendable for the greater good. But Myrtle Warren wasn't just a name on that wall. She was a ghost, still at Hogwarts, still capable of conversation, and if she could remember her death clearly, she might be able to confirm whether Dumbledore's records were accurate. Hermione clutched her notes tighter, feeling the first stirring of something that might eventually become a plan. She couldn't prove these accusations based on a single magical book that no one else had seen. But if she could find corroborating evidence, living witnesses, physical proof, or testimony from the dead themselves, then maybe she could build a case that even the wizarding world's faith in Albus Dumbledore couldn't withstand. She owed it to those 147 names. She owed it to Harry, who apparently was being groomed for sacrifice, and she owed it to every future child who might be deemed expendable for Dumbledore's version of the greater good. The book pulsed warm against her chest as she tucked it inside her robes. Whatever magic powered it, whatever had preserved these records for decades, it had chosen to reveal itself to her for a reason. She intended to make sure that choice mattered. Chapter 3. The Grindelwald Connection. The third night brought revelations that shattered everything Hermione thought she knew about good and evil. She had returned to the restricted section with a specific purpose: to understand the origins of Dumbledore's philosophy. The memorial wall had shown her the scope of his calculated sacrifices, but she needed to comprehend how such a brilliant, seemingly compassionate wizard had arrived at the conclusion that children's deaths were acceptable collateral damage. The warm book seemed to sense her intent. When she opened it this time, the pages had reorganized themselves, presenting a new section she hadn't seen before, a collection of personal correspondence dating back to Dumbledore's youth. The first letter made her hands tremble. My dearest Gellert, as your last letter fills me with such hope for what we might accomplish together. You are right. The current order is unsustainable. Wizards hiding from muggles, suppressing our gifts, accepting the role of the oppressed when we are clearly the superior race. The international statute of secrecy is not protection. It is cowardice. I have been thinking about your phrase, "for the greater good." It captures perfectly what we must embrace. Individual suffering, even individual lives, must be weighed against the monumental change we can bring to the world. A few hundred deaths now to prevent centuries of magical subjugation. The mathematics are undeniable. Come to Godric's Hollow soon. There is so much we need to discuss, and I confess your absence has been painful. With all my affection, Albus Hermione stared at the letter, or her mind struggling to process what she was reading. The handwriting was unmistakably Dumbledore's, but younger, more enthusiastic, and the recipient, Gellert Grindelwald, the dark wizard Dumbledore had supposedly fought against for the good of the wizarding world. Except this letter suggested something entirely different. It suggested they had been allies, partners. The intimate tone implied something even deeper than philosophical agreement. She turned the page with increasing dread and found Grindelwald's response. Beloved Albus, your intelligence continues to astound me. Yes, we must be willing to sacrifice the few for the many. But you must not let sentiment cloud your judgment when the time comes to make these choices. I have seen you hesitate when decisive action was required, and such hesitation serves no one. The Muggle children who witnessed magic in your village, they pose a threat to our cause. Their memories must be modified, or they must be eliminated. There is no third option. Allowing them to live with their knowledge intact is a luxury we cannot afford. I know you believe in redemption, in finding alternatives to death, but some situations require absolute solutions. This is what separates leaders from philosophers. I await your decision with great interest. Forever yours, Gellert. Hermione's stomach churned as she read Dumbledore's reply, dated a week later. Gellert, you were right about the children. I struggled with the decision, but logic demanded action. 3 obliviations and 1 permanent solution. The youngest boy proved resistant to memory modification. I told his parents he'd died of dragonpox. They will never know he died to protect our greater purpose. I am learning to separate necessary actions from personal feelings. You have been an excellent teacher in this regard. When we reshape the world, such sacrifices will be remembered as the foundation of a better age. The plan for the Muggle settlement proceeds. I have identified 17 families whose removal would clear the valley for our experimental community. I will ensure the deaths appear accidental, a gas leak perhaps, or a fire. The wizards who move into their homes afterward will never need to know the cost of their new beginning. Your devoted, Albus. The book slipped from Hermione's nerveless fingers, but the magical binding kept it suspended in her lap, pages still open to Dumbledore's confession of mass murder. She pressed both hands to her mouth, fighting nausea. This wasn't just about allowing children to die for strategic purposes. This was active participation in murder. Dumbledore hadn't simply failed to save people. He had killed them himself, planned the deaths of entire families, and done it all in the name of some grand vision he shared with Grindelwald. When she finally forced herself to keep reading, the letters continued for months, charting the evolution of their partnership and their increasingly ambitious plans. They discussed establishing wizard-ruled territories where Muggles would serve as magical subjects. They planned experiments to determine which magical bloodlines were worth preserving and which should be eliminated for the greater purity of their new world. And through it all, as they refined their philosophy of acceptable sacrifice, with Dumbledore proving surprisingly adept at calculating the lives that could be spent in service of their cause. Then she found the letter that explained everything. Gellert, Ariana is dead. I know I told you about her condition, how the Muggle boy's attack damaged her magical core, made her unpredictable. Yesterday she tried to stop our argument with Aberforth, and her magic lashed out uncontrollably. By the time the curse fire died down, she was gone. I cannot say whose spell killed her. Yours, mine, Aberforth's. It happened too quickly. But I know this. Her death was the result of the path we have chosen. We spoke of necessary sacrifices, but I never imagined my own sister would be among them. Aberforth blames me. He is not wrong. If I had not been so consumed with our grand plans, if I had been here to care for her properly instead of dreaming of reshaping the world, she might still live. I am withdrawing from our partnership. I cannot continue down this path, cannot make decisions that require more Orianas to die. The greater good we spoke of, I fear it is an excuse for monstrous acts, not a justification for them. Find another ally for your revolution. I am no longer suited for such work. Albus. Hermione felt tears on her cheeks. Finally, something that showed Dumbledore's conscience, some evidence that he had recognized the horror of what they were planning. But when she turned the page, she found a personal journal entry dated years later that destroyed even that small comfort. Today marks the 10th anniversary of Ariana's death. Aberforth still will not speak to me, and I cannot blame him. But as I reflect on those months with Gellert, I realize I was not wrong about the necessity of sacrifice, only wrong about the scale. The war against Grindelwald has shown me that my younger self's vision was flawed but not fundamentally incorrect. Individual lives must sometimes be weighed against the greater good. The difference is that such decisions must be made by those wise enough to bear the burden, not by those drunk on power and ideology. I am older now, wiser. I understand that leadership requires terrible choices. The deaths during my youth were needless because they served Gellert's vision, not a truly greater good. But death in service of protecting the innocent, preserving the balance of magic, but ensuring the defeat of true darkness, such deaths have meaning. I will not make Gellert's mistake of pursuing power for its own sake. But neither will I make the mistake of refusing to act when action is required, regardless of the cost to my conscience. Some wizards are born to make impossible choices. I believe I am one of them. Hermione closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the implications. Dumbledore hadn't learned from his mistakes with Grindelwald. He had simply refined his approach. The young man who had planned to murder Muggle families had grown into a leader who calculated which wizarding children could be sacrificed for strategic advantage. The philosophy was the same. Only the targets had changed. She forced herself to continue reading. And the journal entries that followed painted a picture of a man who had convinced himself that his past errors qualified him to make life and death decisions for others. Entry after entry showed him applying lessons learned from his partnership with Grindelwald, using the same calculating approach to determine which lives were expendable. The Riddle Boy shows promise. Read one entry from 1943. His investigation into the Chamber of Secrets could provide valuable intelligence about Salazar Slytherin's methods. I will not interfere with his experiments. The knowledge gained outweighs the risk to individual students. If deaths result, they will serve a greater understanding of ancient magic. Besides, the boy's obvious dark tendencies make him a useful test case. Or better to observe how such magic corrupts a young mind than to remain ignorant of the process. Future dark wizards may follow similar patterns, and this knowledge could prove invaluable. Another entry, dated 1979. Young Severus Snape brings word that the Dark Lord is seeking a spy within my ranks. I will provide him with one. Not the double agent he expects, but genuine intelligence. Several Order members have outlived their usefulness, and their sacrifice will cement Severus's position within Voldemort's inner circle. The strategic value outweighs the personal cost. And then, devastating in its clinical precision, an entry from 1981. The prophecy regarding the Potter boy has been fulfilled, though not as I expected. Voldemort's attempt to kill the child has apparently resulted in his own temporary defeat, an outcome far preferable to my original calculations. I had anticipated needing to sacrifice the boy myself when the time was right. The child's survival presents new opportunities. His connection to Voldemort, forged by the failed killing curse, may prove invaluable in eventual victory. I will monitor his development carefully and ensure he grows into the weapon necessary to defeat the Dark Lord permanently. His placement with the Dursleys, while superficially cruel, will serve multiple purposes. It will keep him humble, prevent him from becoming arrogant about his fame, and most importantly, ensure he values the wizarding world enough to die for it when the time comes. A child raised in comfort might hesitate at the necessary moment. One raised in deprivation will embrace martyrdom. Hermione stood abruptly, the book falling closed in her lap. She couldn't read anymore, couldn't process the systematic way Dumbledore had planned Harry's childhood suffering, couldn't bear to think about how many other strategic decisions were documented in these pages. Everything she had believed about the war against Voldemort, about the protection of Harry, about Dumbledore's noble leadership, all of it was a lie. Or rather, all of it was true from one perspective, and a calculated manipulation from another. Dumbledore wasn't protecting Harry. He was preparing him for sacrifice, just as he had prepared so many others over the decades. The warm book pulsed against her legs, as if responding to her distress. When she opened it again, but it had turned to the memorial wall she had discovered the night before. But now she understood the full context of those names, saw them not as isolated tragedies, but as part of a decades-long pattern that stretched back to Dumbledore's youth. He had been making these choices for 60 years, had refined his methods, improved his calculations, learned to hide his intentions behind grandfatherly kindness and inspirational speeches about love conquering darkness. But the core philosophy remained unchanged from his letters to Grindelwald. Some lives were more valuable than others, and those in power had the right to decide who lived and who died. As she stared at the memorial wall, one realization crystallized with terrible clarity. She couldn't tell anyone about this. Who would believe her? And even if they did, what would be the result? Dumbledore was the only wizard Voldemort feared, the only leader capable of organizing resistance against the Death Eaters. Revealing his true nature might save future victims of his calculations, but it would also leave the wizarding world defenseless against a threat that was already growing stronger. She was trapped between impossible choices: expose a monster and doom the world, or remain silent and become complicit in whatever sacrifices he deemed necessary. For the first time, Hermione truly understood the weight of the phrase that had guided Dumbledore's life: for the greater good. She just wasn't sure she could bear to live by it. Chapter 4. The Weight of Secrets. By day, Hermione Granger was still the brightest witch of her age. She answered questions in Transfiguration with her usual precision. Her essays remained flawless, and her notes were as meticulously organized as ever. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the same dedicated student she had always been, perhaps slightly more focused on her studies due to the ongoing chamber crisis. But inside, she was drowning. 3 nights of revelations had left her feeling as though she were carrying a lead weight in her chest, heavy and cold, and impossible to ignore. Every time she looked at Professor Dumbledore during meals, she saw not the kindly headmaster, but the young man who had planned the murder of Muggle families. When he smiled at students or offered gentle words of encouragement, she heard the clinical precision with which he had calculated acceptable losses. The worst part was that no one else could see it. His performance was flawless. "Hermione, oh, are you even listening?" Ron's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. She blinked and found herself in the common room, staring at her potions essay without having written a word for the past 20 minutes. "Sorry," she said, forcing her voice to sound normal. "Just thinking about the chamber situation." Harry leaned forward in his chair, his green eyes bright with the intensity he always showed when discussing the mystery. "That's actually what we wanted to talk to you about. Ron thinks we should try to get into the Slytherin common room again, see if we can overhear anything useful." "It's not a terrible idea," Ron added, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own proposal. "I mean, whoever opened the chamber has to be a Slytherin, right? They'd probably brag about it to their mates." Hermione nodded absently, but her mind wasn't on their plans. Instead, she was remembering Dumbledore's journal entries about Tom Riddle, about how he had deliberately allowed the chamber to remain open 50 years ago, because the intelligence gathered was worth more than Myrtle Warren's life. Was he making the same calculation now? Was he allowing students to be petrified because stopping the attacks too quickly would prevent him from learning something valuable about the enemy's methods? "Earth to Hermione," Harry said, waving a hand in front of her face. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one where you're thinking so hard it looks painful," Ron said. "You've been doing it a lot lately. Are you sure you're all right?" She wanted to tell them, but the words sat in her throat like stones, desperate to spill out. "Harry, you need to know that Dumbledore has been planning your death since you were a baby. Ron, every protection you think you have is just part of a larger strategy that treats your life as expendable." But she couldn't. Not just because they wouldn't believe her, though they probably wouldn't, but because the knowledge would destroy them. Harry, who had grown up thinking Dumbledore was the only adult who truly cared about him, would be shattered. And Ron, whose family had followed Dumbledore unquestioningly for years, would lose the foundation of everything he believed about good and evil. More than that, she was beginning to understand Dumbledore's terrible logic. If Voldemort truly was as dangerous as she had been taught, as if he really was the greatest threat the wizarding world had ever faced, then maybe calculated sacrifices were necessary. Maybe the deaths of individuals, even children, were preferable to the deaths of thousands that would result from Voldemort's victory. The thought made her feel sick, but she couldn't entirely dismiss it. "I'm fine," she lied, closing her potions book. "Just tired. I think I'll go to bed early." She made it to the dormitory stairs before Harry called after her. "Hermione, wait." She turned, hoping her expression didn't reveal the turmoil underneath. "If something was wrong," he said quietly, "you'd tell us, wouldn't you? I mean, we're friends. We're supposed to help each other." The genuine concern in his voice almost broke her resolve. This was Harry at his best, the boy who would risk everything for his friends, who had already proven he would walk into danger to protect others. The boy Dumbledore was carefully shaping into someone willing to die for the greater good. "Of course," she managed, "but really I'm fine. Just stressed about exams." Harry's expression suggested he didn't entirely believe her, but he nodded. "All right. But you know we're here if you need us, right?" She nodded back and escaped upstairs before the tears could start. Alone in the dormitory, she collapsed onto her bed and buried her face in her pillow. The weight of Dumbledore's secrets felt crushing, but worse was the growing realization that she understood why he carried them alone. This knowledge wasn't meant to be shared. It was too dangerous, too destructive to everything people needed to believe about their protectors. She thought about approaching Professor McGonagall, the one adult at Hogwarts who seemed genuinely incorruptible. But what would she say? That she had found a magical book that revealed decades of strategic murders. That the headmaster McGonagall respected and trusted was actually a calculating manipulator who viewed students as pawns in a larger game. Even if McGonagall believed her, which was unlikely, what then? The revelation would tear apart the Order of the Phoenix, destroy the resistance to Voldemort, and leave the wizarding world leaderless at the moment they needed unity most. And if McGonagall was already aware of Dumbledore's methods, if she was complicit in his decisions, then revealing her knowledge would only put Hermione in danger. The same logic applied to every adult she could think of. They were either ignorant and would be destroyed by the truth, or they were aware and had already made their peace with necessary evils. That night, her dreams were filled with names from the memorial wall. Children she had never met called out to her, asking why no one remembered them, why their deaths had been forgotten while Dumbledore was celebrated as a hero. She woke several times, heart pounding, their voices echoing in her ears. The next morning at breakfast, she watched Dumbledore address the students about the chamber situation. He spoke with perfect compassion about the tragedy of the attacks, his voice heavy with what seemed like genuine sorrow for the petrified victims. But now Hermione could see the performance underneath, the way he paced his words for maximum emotional impact, the strategic pauses that allowed fear and hope to build in precisely the right proportions, the careful balance between acknowledging danger and maintaining morale. Everything was calculated, even his kindness. "Miss Granger," she startled, and realized Professor McGonagall was standing beside her at the Gryffindor table, looking concerned. "You haven't touched your breakfast," McGonagall said. "Are you feeling well?" Hermione glanced down at her untouched porridge, then up at her head of house. For a moment, she considered telling McGonagall everything, about the book, the memorial wall, the journal entries that revealed Dumbledore's true nature. But then, she saw something that stopped her cold. A flicker of recognition in McGonagall's eyes, quickly suppressed, as if she already knew something was troubling Hermione, and as if she had been told to watch for signs that certain students were learning things they shouldn't know. "Just tired," Hermione said carefully. "I've been staying up too late studying." McGonagall nodded, but her gaze remained sharp. "Perhaps you should consider getting more rest. Exhaustion can lead to poor judgment." The warning was subtle, but unmistakable. Hermione managed a smile and nodded. "You're probably right, Professor. I'll try to get to bed earlier tonight." "See that you do." As McGonagall moved on to address other students, Hermione felt the walls closing in around her. If McGonagall knew she was investigating something she shouldn't be, then Dumbledore knew as well, which meant her late-night trips to the restricted section were not as secret as she had believed. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it brought a strange sort of clarity. She was already in danger. The question was whether she would use the time she had left to gather more evidence or to find a way to act on what she had learned. That evening, she sat in the common room with Harry and Ron, helping them plan another investigation into the chamber mystery. She listened to their theories, offered suggestions for their research, and maintained the facade of the helpful friend they expected her to be. But underneath, she was making plans of her own. If Dumbledore was watching her, if he knew she had discovered his secrets, then her time was limited. She needed to find the archive, the hidden room marked on his map, and document whatever evidence it contained before he decided she had become too dangerous to ignore. As the names on the memorial wall deserved justice, Harry deserved to know the truth about his planned sacrifice, and if she was going to become another casualty of Dumbledore's greater good, she was determined to leave behind proof that would eventually expose him for what he really was. As she watched Harry laugh at one of Ron's jokes, his face bright with the innocence that Dumbledore was systematically destroying, she made her final decision. She would find the archive tomorrow night, whatever the cost. If she disappeared afterward, if she became another name on Dumbledore's list of necessary sacrifices, at least she would die knowing she had tried to protect the people she loved from the monster hiding behind grandfatherly smiles and inspirational speeches. The weight in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else. Resolve. She would not let Dumbledore's victims be forgotten, and she would not let Harry walk blindly toward the sacrifice that had been planned for him since birth, even if it killed her to prevent it. Chapter 5. Harry in the Crosshairs. The fourth night brought the revelation that shattered whatever remained of Hermione's faith in the adults meant to protect them. She had returned to the restricted section with a specific question burning in her mind. If Dumbledore had been calculating strategic sacrifices for decades, what role did Harry play in his grand design? The boy who had survived the killing curse, who was famous throughout the wizarding world for defeating Voldemort as an infant. Surely such a valuable asset would be central to whatever plans Dumbledore was making. The warm book seemed to anticipate her need. When she opened it this time, the pages had reorganized themselves around a new section, labeled simply, The Potter Asset. The first document made her hands shake. Assessment of subject, Harry James Potter. Date, November 2nd, 1981. Classification, Strategic Asset, Tier 1. Following the unexpected failure of the Dark Lord's killing curse, preliminary observations suggest the Potter child has acquired unique magical properties. The connection forged by the failed curse may prove invaluable in eventual victory over Voldemort. However, the child's development must be carefully managed to ensure optimal utility when the final confrontation occurs. Recommendations. 1. Placement with Muggle relatives will ensure subject develops proper appreciation for Wizarding World 2. And controlled deprivation will build character necessary for ultimate sacrifice. 3. Strategic isolation will prevent subject from developing excessive self-worth or questioning authority. 4. Minimal intervention policy. Allow subject to face age-appropriate dangers to build courage and martyr complex. Note: subject must survive to age of majority, but should not be made aware of true destiny until absolutely necessary. A willing sacrifice carries far more power than a reluctant one. *APWB. Dumbledore*. Hermione pressed both hands to her mouth, fighting waves of nausea. This wasn't just another strategic calculation. This was a detailed plan for Harry's entire childhood, designed to shape him into someone willing to die on command. She forced herself to keep reading, and the documents that followed painted a picture of manipulation so complete it took her breath away. Progress report. Potter asset date, July 15th, 1984. Subject's placement with the Dursley family continues to yield desired results. Mrs. Figg reports the boy shows signs of emotional deprivation appropriate for his age, withdrawn behavior, excessive eagerness to please authority figures, diminished self-regard. The Dursleys' neglect is proceeding within acceptable parameters. Note: Cousin Dudley's physical bullying has accelerated subjects' development of protective instincts toward vulnerable individuals. This trait will be essential for final phase compliance. Recommend continued non-intervention in domestic situation despite reports of insufficient food and inadequate living conditions. More character building requires genuine hardship, not manufactured difficulty. Hermione felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Every summer Harry returned to the Dursleys. Every story he had told about sleeping in the cupboard under the stairs, every casual mention of going hungry, all of it could have been prevented. Dumbledore had known exactly what was happening, and had chosen to allow it, because Harry's suffering served his purposes. The next document made her stomach clench with recognition. Incident report. Platform 9 3/4. Barrier malfunction. Date: September 1st, 1992. Successfully prevented Potter Asset and Weasley Secondary Asset from boarding Hogwarts Express through controlled barrier closure. The subject's subsequent arrival by flying car created optimal conditions for testing Asset's decision-making under pressure while providing valuable intelligence about his priorities. Key observations. Asset chose to break wizarding law rather than miss school term. Demonstrating proper attachment to magical education, Asset prioritized friends' welfare over personal safety during dangerous flight. Asset accepted punishment without attempting to shift blame to authority figures. Asset's immediate concern was for consequences to friend rather than personal difficulties. Conclusion. Character development proceeding as predicted. Asset shows strong protective instincts and self-sacrificial tendencies necessary for final phase. Will recommend continued exposure to controlled dangers throughout school year. Hermione's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her. The barrier closing at King's Cross Station hadn't been an accident or malfunction. It had been a deliberate test orchestrated by Dumbledore. Harry and Ron's terrifying flight to Hogwarts, their near-death experience with the Whomping Willow, the disciplinary hearing that had nearly gotten them expelled, all of it had been planned as a way to evaluate Harry's character and decision-making under pressure. She thought about how frightened Harry had been that night, how worried about getting Ron in trouble, how he had blamed himself for everything that went wrong. She remembered comforting him, telling him it wasn't his fault, that sometimes bad things just happened, but it had been his fault, not because he had done anything wrong, but because Dumbledore had deliberately put him in an impossible situation to see how he would react. The documents continued, detailing incident after incident from their first year that she now realized had been carefully orchestrated tests. The Philosopher's Stone operation provided exceptional intelligence about Asset's capabilities and character. Observations. Asset prioritized protection of valuable magical artifact over personal safety. Asset demonstrated natural leadership when placed in group dynamic with secondary assets. Asset showed appropriate deference to authority while maintaining independence of thought. Asset's confrontation with Quirrell/Voldemort confirmed magical connection remains intact. Most significantly, Asset chose to pursue Quirrell despite explicit instructions from faculty to remain safe. This demonstrates the precise balance of rule-following and rebellious independence necessary for final phase compliance. Subject will obey ultimate command while believing it was his own decision. Note: Asset's near death during confrontation was unfortunate, but provided valuable data about the connection's protective properties. Recommend similar controlled exposures to mortal danger throughout remaining school years. Hermione closed the book with shaking hands, unable to read anymore. Every adventure they had shared, every danger they had faced, every moment when she had marveled at Harry's bravery, it had all been part of Dumbledore's careful conditioning. Harry wasn't a hero making impossible choices. He was a weapon being forged through calculated trauma. But the worst realization was still to come. When she opened the book again, seeking some evidence that Dumbledore retained some shred of genuine care for Harry, she found instead a section labeled Final Phase Preparations. The prophecy's wording is unambiguous. Neither can live while the other survives. This presents both opportunity and complication. The Dark Lord's return is inevitable. My network confirms his continued existence despite his apparent destruction. When he regains physical form, The final confrontation will require Potter's willing sacrifice. The connection created by the failed killing curse means Potter carries a piece of Voldemort's soul. This fragment must be destroyed for the Dark Lord to be truly defeated, and the destruction will require Potter's death. The strategic value of this sacrifice cannot be overstated. It will eliminate Voldemort permanently while creating a martyr whose memory can unite the wizarding world. However, Potter must choose this sacrifice freely. A reluctant or coerced death will lack the necessary power. Therefore, all conditioning must be designed to make him believe sacrifice is his own idea, his own moral choice. He must die convinced he is saving others, not because he was ordered to do so. Timeline estimate: 5 to 7 years for complete preparation. But Asset must develop sufficient emotional attachments to Wizarding World to make sacrifice meaningful while maintaining psychological profile that prioritizes others' welfare over self-preservation. Success probability: 87% based on current character development trajectory. Hermione slammed the book shut so hard that several volumes on nearby shelves rattled. She stood abruptly, pacing between the towering bookcases as the full scope of Dumbledore's plan crystallized in her mind. Harry was going to die, not in some distant, hypothetical future, but as the culmination of a strategy that had begun the moment Voldemort's killing curse failed. Every kindness Dumbledore had shown him, every protection he had provided, as every piece of guidance he had offered, it was all designed to shepherd Harry toward a willing death when the time was right. And Harry had no idea. He trusted Dumbledore completely, looked up to him as the grandfather he had never had. The very love and loyalty Dumbledore had cultivated would be the weapons used to convince Harry to walk to his own execution. She thought about the chamber situation, about how Dumbledore was allowing students to be petrified while Harry investigated the mystery. Now she understood why. It wasn't just about gathering intelligence or testing Harry's courage. It was about reinforcing his sense of responsibility for others, his conviction that their safety was worth any personal risk. When the time came for Harry to sacrifice himself, he would do it not because he was ordered to, but because he believed it was the only way to save everyone he cared about. The guilt and responsibility that Dumbledore had been building in him since childhood would make the choice feel inevitable. The warm book pulsed against her leg where she had dropped it, as if responding to her distress. She picked it up with trembling hands and opened it one final time, hoping desperately to find some evidence that she had misunderstood, that Dumbledore's plans weren't as monstrous as they appeared. Instead, she found a personal letter dated just 3 months ago. My dear Nicholas, your concerns about the Potter boy's welfare are noted but misguided. Yes, his summers with the Dursleys are unpleasant, but comfort now would undermine the character development necessary for his ultimate purpose. A boy who grows up beloved and protected will not readily choose death for others. One who grows up knowing suffering will embrace martyrdom as escape and redemption. You ask if there is no other way. I have studied the prophecy for 11 years, consulted every expert in divination, researched every possible interpretation. The conclusion is unavoidable. Potter must die to defeat Voldemort permanently. The only variable under our control is whether that death serves our cause or theirs. I take no pleasure in this necessity. The boy is dear to me, in his way. But individual affection cannot be allowed to compromise strategic imperatives. We are fighting for the future of the wizarding world, and such a future is worth any price, including the life of one exceptionally brave young man. I trust you will continue to support this course of action, despite your personal reservations. The alternative, allowing Voldemort to return to full power, would result in far more deaths than the single sacrifice we require. With respect and determination, Albus. Hermione felt something break inside her chest, some final wall between childhood and the terrible adult understanding that the people meant to protect you might be the ones planning your destruction. Harry was going to die, and everyone who claimed to love him was part of the conspiracy to make it happen. Worse, when the moment came, Harry would thank them for the privilege of sacrificing himself. He would go to his death believing it was noble, necessary, and entirely his own choice. She clutched the book to her chest and wept, for Harry, who was being shaped into a willing sacrifice, for herself, who now carried the unbearable knowledge of his fate, and for the world that required the death of good people to preserve itself from evil ones. But beneath the grief, something harder was taking shape, a resolution born of desperation and love. She couldn't tell Harry the truth. The knowledge would destroy him, and worse, it might make him refuse to play his part when the time came. If Dumbledore was right about Voldemort's return, if Harry's death was truly necessary to defeat him permanently, then warning Harry might doom the entire wizarding world. But she could try to find another way. Could research the prophecy herself? Look for interpretations Dumbledore might have missed or deliberately ignored. Could search for alternatives that didn't require Harry's willing participation in his own murder. And if no other option existed, if Harry truly had to die to save everyone else, then she would make sure he died knowing he was loved for himself, not just for his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. The memorial wall had shown her that Dumbledore's victims were forgotten, their deaths reduced to strategic calculations in his private records. She would not let that happen to Harry Potter. Whatever it cost her, whatever risks she had to take, she would ensure that when the time came, Harry's choice would be truly his own, made with full knowledge of what was being asked of him and why. Dumbledore wanted a willing martyr, shaped by manipulation and emotional conditioning. Hermione was determined to give him something far more dangerous. A young man who chose his own fate with eyes wide open and a heart full of love rather than manufactured guilt. The difference might not save Harry's life, but it would preserve something more important, his agency in the face of those who would reduce him to a strategic asset. She owed him that much. She owed him everything. Chapter 6. The Other Casualties. The fifth night brought the realization that she might not survive long enough to save Harry. Hermione had returned to the restricted section with a new question burning in her mind. What had happened to others who had discovered Dumbledore's secrets? Surely, over the decades, someone else must have stumbled across evidence of his calculated sacrifices. Someone must have questioned the convenient deaths, the strategic timing of tragedies, the pattern of losses that always seemed to serve Dumbledore's greater purpose. The warm book seemed to sense her growing paranoia. When she opened it, the pages had reorganized themselves around a section she hadn't seen before. Security protocols and containment procedures. The first document made her blood run cold. Assessment of potential security. Risks, internal threats to operational security, require immediate and decisive response. The following individuals have demonstrated dangerous curiosity about strategic operations. 1. Mundungus Fletcher, Order Member. Excessive questions about mission casualties. Recommended response. Staged overdose. Accidental magic interaction. Status. Resolved. 1979. 2. Caradoc Dearborn, Order Member. Investigating discrepancies in intelligence reports. Recommended response. Disappeared during Death Eater raid. Real raid. Strategic non-rescue. Status. Resolved. 1978. 3. Marlene McKinnon, Order Member. Questioning strategy behind Priwet brothers' deaths. Recommended response. Family elimination disguised as Death Eater revenge attack. Status. Resolved. 1981. Note. Order members pose significant risk due to operational access and combat experience. Elimination must appear consistent with wartime casualties to avoid suspicion among remaining assets. Hermione's hands shook as she read the clinical descriptions of murder, disguised as wartime casualties. But these weren't strategic sacrifices for the greater good. These were targeted assassinations of people who had gotten too close to the truth. She forced herself to keep reading. and the documents that followed revealed a pattern of elimination that stretched back decades. Student Risk Assessment, Hogwarts Internal Threats. Date: Various Marcus Belby, Ravenclaw, 7th year, 1963. Discovered inconsistencies in official records of the chamber incident. Attempted to research Tom Riddle's background. Recommended response: cursed objects in dormitory, untraceable magic poisoning. Status: resolved. Reported as accidental exposure to experimental potion. Sarah Clearwater, Hufflepuff, 6th year, 1971. Asked too many questions about missing students during Grindelwald period. Began correlating dates with strategic intelligence victories. Recommended response: memory modification, followed by staged accident. Status: resolved. Family believes she died in Quidditch accident. Timothy Goldstein, Gryffindor, 7th year, 1976. Discovered memorial wall documentation through unauthorized access to restricted section. Attempted to warn fellow students. Recommended response: immediate termination, body disposal, comprehensive memory modification of associates. Status: resolved. Reported as runaway, family memory modified. Hermione had to close the book and press both hands to her mouth to keep from being sick. Timothy Goldstein had found exactly what she was finding now, had tried to warn people just as she wanted to warn Harry and Ron. And Dumbledore had killed him for it. Her situation wasn't unique. She was following in the footsteps of others who had discovered the truth, and all of them had died or disappeared. When she forced herself to open the book again, she found a section that made her realize the full scope of Dumbledore's surveillance network. Current monitoring protocols, enhanced observation of students showing signs of unauthorized investigation into historical records. Key indicators include extended time in restricted section outside normal research hours, unusual interest in historical magical conflicts, questions about discrepancies in official accounts of student deaths, research patterns suggesting systematic investigation rather than academic curiosity, behavioral changes consistent with processing traumatic information. Active monitoring subjects: Hermione Jean Granger, Gryffindor, 2nd year. Exceeded normal research parameters by 340% since Halloween incident. And pattern suggests discovery of sensitive materials. Recommend escalation to Phase 2 monitoring. Her blood froze. They knew. Had known for days, possibly since her first night investigating. Every trip to the library, every late-night research session, every moment she thought she was safely alone. They had been watching. She was already marked for elimination. The book grew warmer in her lap, and she realized with growing horror that it might be more than just a repository of information. It might be a trap designed to identify students who possessed the dangerous combination of curiosity and moral conviction that had gotten Timothy Goldstein killed. But if that were true, why show her all of this? Why reveal decades of murders and strategic sacrifices unless they wanted her to know? Right, unless the knowledge itself was part of the punishment. She turned to a new section and found her worst fears confirmed. Psychological profile: Hermione Granger. Subject demonstrates exceptional intelligence combined with rigid moral framework and strong protective instincts toward friends. This combination makes her unsuitable for standard memory modification protocols. Her analytical mind would likely detect inconsistencies and resist alterations. Recommended approach: full disclosure followed by psychological isolation. Subject's moral rigidity will prevent her from sharing information that could harm innocent individuals. Her protective instincts toward Potter and Weasley assets make her effectively self-silencing. Timeline: allow subject to discover full scope of operations over 5 to 7 nights. Monitor for signs of attempted communication with peers or faculty. If subject remains isolated and non-communicative, maintain current status with enhanced monitoring. If subject attempts to warn others or interfere with Potter conditioning, implement immediate termination protocols. Note: Subject's analytical capabilities make her potentially valuable as future asset if properly motivated. Consider recruitment approach following psychological breakdown phase. Hermione stood so abruptly that the book fell from her lap, hitting the stone floor with an echo that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet library. They weren't just watching her, they were manipulating her, allowing her to discover the truth because they believed it would break her psychologically and make her useful to their purposes. Every revelation, to every horrifying document, every name on the memorial wall, it was all being fed to her deliberately, a carefully orchestrated psychological assault designed to leave her isolated, terrified, and compliant. But that realization brought with it a spark of something unexpected: fury. She picked up the book with trembling hands and opened it to a section she hadn't seen before, one that appeared to be updating in real time. Live monitoring report. Subject Granger. Current psychological state: elevated stress, social withdrawal, decreased academic performance, nightmares reported by dormitory mates, paranoid behavior, including frequent checking of surroundings and suspicion of routine interactions. Assessment: subject responding to information exposure as predicted, psychological isolation increasing. There's no attempted communication with Potter or Weasley assets regarding sensitive materials, no contact with faculty members outside normal academic interactions. Recommendation: continue current protocol. Subject shows signs of impending psychological break that will facilitate either recruitment or elimination, depending on subsequent choices. The words were appearing even as she read them, written in real time by whoever was watching her. They were documenting her breakdown, like researchers studying a laboratory specimen. She thought about the past few days, her withdrawal from Harry and Ron, her sleepless nights, her inability to focus on normal activities. All of it had been observed, catalogued, analyzed for signs of weakness and compliance. But they had made one crucial mistake in their assessment. They assumed her moral rigidity would paralyze her, would make her too frightened of consequences to act. They didn't understand that sometimes moral rigidity could become moral clarity. She turned to the last page of the monitoring report and found something that crystallized her resolve. Contingency plan. Subject elimination. If Subject Granger shows signs of attempting to warn Potter asset or interfere with strategic operations, implement following protocol. 1. Stage accidental death during current chamber crisis, basilisk attack, magical accident, etc. 2. Modify memory of Potter and Weasley assets to remove emotional attachment and prevent investigation. 3. Use subject's death as additional trauma bonding for Potter asset. Reinforce theme that caring about others leads to loss. Note: subject's death could serve dual purpose of eliminating security risk while providing valuable conditioning experience for Potter asset. Time trauma to coincide with chamber resolution for maximum psychological impact. They weren't just planning to kill her, they were planning to use her death as another tool to manipulate Harry, to reinforce his guilt complex and drive him further toward willing sacrifice. Hermione closed the book carefully and stood in the center of the restricted section, surrounded by thousands of volumes containing centuries of magical knowledge. She thought about Timothy Goldstein, about Caradoc Dearborn, about all the others who had discovered the truth and died for it. But she also thought about something the monitoring reports had missed. Her friendship with Harry and Ron wasn't just emotional attachment. It was strategic alliance. And unlike the previous victims, she wasn't alone in a school full of potential enemies. She had allies who trusted her completely, who would believe her if she presented evidence properly, and who possessed the same moral conviction that had driven her to investigate in the first place. The book had revealed Dumbledore's secrets, but it had also revealed his weaknesses. He relied on isolation, on making his victims believe they had no choice but to comply or die. He counted on moral people being too paralyzed by the scope of consequences to take action. but Hermione had spent 2 years learning that impossible situations could be solved through careful planning, loyal friends, and the willingness to break rules when rules served evil purposes. She tucked the book inside her robes and made her way quietly toward Gryffindor Tower. Tomorrow, she would begin gathering allies and evidence. She would find a way to warn Harry without triggering the elimination protocols, and she would ensure that when the final confrontation came, it would be on terms Dumbledore hadn't planned for. The memorial wall had shown her the names of those who had died because they stood alone against a monster who wore the face of a grandfather. She would not die alone. And she would not let Harry die believing lies about love and sacrifice. The war between Dumbledore and Voldemort would continue, but it would no longer be fought only with the lives of children who didn't know they were weapons. Some weapons, just when they discovered their true purpose, chose to point themselves at different targets. Hermione Granger had just made that choice. Chapter 7. Confronting the Evidence. The 6th day brought desperate attempts to prove herself wrong. Hermione had barely slept since discovering the monitoring reports. Every shadow in the corridors might hide an observer. Every casual glance from a professor might signal that her elimination had been ordered. But beneath the fear ran something stronger. The methodical mind that had made her the brightest witch of her age demanded corroboration. The magical book could be an elaborate deception. The documents could be forgeries. Her own desperate desire to understand the chamber situation might be making her see patterns where none existed. Before she risked everything on what she had learned, she needed independent verification. She began with the polyjuice potion. For weeks, she and Harry and Ron had been secretly brewing the complex transformation draft in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, planning to use it to infiltrate Slytherin House and question Malfoy about the chamber. But Hermione realized the potion offered her a different opportunity, the chance to investigate restricted areas without being recognized. That afternoon, while Harry and Ron attended Quidditch practice, she slipped into the abandoned bathroom and carefully extracted a vial of the nearly complete potion. It would need another few days to fully mature, but what she had would serve her purposes. She also needed a heir. Professor Sprout's greenhouse assistants came and went frequently, carrying supplies between the castle and the grounds. It took only a moment's distraction during herbology class to pluck a single brown hair from Janet Clearwater's outer robes when the 7th-year student bent over a devil's snare specimen. That evening, Hermione waited until her dorm mates were asleep, then crept back to Myrtle's bathroom with the partially complete potion and Janet's hair. The transformation was uncomfortable and incomplete. Her features shifted only partially, leaving her looking like a blurred combination of herself and the older student, but it was enough to fool casual observation. Moving through the castle in her altered form, she made her way to areas she had never dared explore before. The administrative wing, where student records were kept. The restricted floors above Dumbledore's office. The old dungeons that housed archived magical documents dating back centuries. In a dusty chamber 3 levels below the hospital wing, she found what she was looking for. Physical records that predated magical documentation, handwritten logs that couldn't be altered with simple charms. The student death records told a different story than the official histories. Marcus Belby, deceased November 15th, 1963. Cause: experimental potion exposure. Circumstances: found in Ravenclaw common room with evidence of unauthorized magical research. Personal effects included notes about inconsistencies in historical records and questions about Tom Riddle. Effect disposal supervised by A. Dumbledore. Sarah Clearwater, deceased March 3rd, 1971. Cause: accidental magic surge during Quidditch match. To circumstances: player lost control during routine training flight, magic destabilized. Previous disciplinary notes indicate student had been asking inappropriate questions about missing students during recent historical periods. Incident investigation concluded by A. Dumbledore. Timothy Goldstein, missing September 12th, 1976. Last seen. Restricted section of library during unauthorized evening access. Search concluded after 1 week. Family notified of suspected runaway. Personal effects included extensive notes about memorial documentation and patterns of strategic deaths. Investigation supervised by A. Dumbledore. Each death followed the same pattern. A student began investigating historical irregularities, asked uncomfortable questions, and then died in circumstances that were suspicious but not provably unnatural. And in every case, Dumbledore himself had overseen the official investigation, ensuring no one looked too closely at the details. The physical records corroborated everything she had read in the magical book. These weren't fabricated documents designed to manipulate her. They were genuine administrative records that painted a decades-long picture of systematic elimination. But she needed more. She needed testimony from someone who had witnessed these deaths, someone who might remember details that hadn't been recorded in official files. Nearly headless Nick had been Gryffindor's ghost for over 500 years. He would have been present for all of the deaths she had documented. And unlike living witnesses, the dead couldn't be memory modified or silenced through conventional threats. She found him in the abandoned corridor near the Transfiguration classroom, drifting through walls with his usual melancholic air. "Sir Nicholas?" she called softly, still wearing Janet Clearwater's partially transformed appearance. "Could I speak with you about something?" The ghost turned, his nearly severed head wobbling precariously. "Of course, my dear. Though I'm afraid I don't recognize you. Are you new to Gryffindor?" "I'm researching something for a project," Hermione said carefully, "about students who died at Hogwarts during the past century. I was hoping you might remember some of them." Nick's expression immediately became guarded. "I'm not sure that's an appropriate topic for a school project, my dear. And perhaps you should speak with your head of house about more suitable research subjects." "Please," Hermione pressed. "I just need to know if you remember Marcus Belby. He died in 1963. The ghost's form flickered, a sign of distress among the deceased. That name is familiar, but I'm afraid I cannot. That is to say, there are certain topics that are not suitable for discussion with students." "What about Sarah Clearwater?" "She died in 1971. Nick's flickering intensified. "My dear child, I really must insist that you speak with Professor McGonagall about your project. These are not matters for casual inquiry." "Timothy Goldstein, 1976. At the mention of Timothy's name, Nick's form became so unstable that he was nearly invisible. When he solidified again, his expression was pained. "I cannot," he said firmly. I'd instructed not to discuss certain historical events with students. The headmaster was very clear about this restriction. It is for the safety of all concerned." "Instructed by Dumbledore?" Nick looked around nervously, as if checking for eavesdroppers, even though they were alone in the abandoned corridor. "I cannot say more. Please, for your own welfare, abandon this line of inquiry. Some knowledge is too dangerous for the living to possess." He drifted away through the wall before Hermione could ask another question, leaving her standing alone with the confirmation she had dreaded. Even the dead were complicit in Dumbledore's conspiracy of silence. The partial transformation was beginning to fade, her features slowly reverting to their natural state. She made her way carefully back toward Gryffindor Tower, but stopped when she passed the entrance to Dumbledore's office. If she was going to gather evidence, she needed to see what magical protections Dumbledore used to guard his most dangerous secrets. The gargoyle statue stood motionless before the spiral staircase, its stone eyes seeming to track her movement, even though she knew it was just a carved guardian. "Lemon drops," she whispered, remembering a password Harry had mentioned from his previous visits to the office. The gargoyle sprang aside without hesitation. Hermione's heart pounded as she climbed the spiral staircase, but she forced herself to continue. If she was caught, she could claim to be seeking help with her project research. It was a thin excuse, But better than no plan at all. The office door was unlocked, much which surprised her, until she realized that Dumbledore probably relied on magical protections rather than physical barriers. She pushed it open carefully and stepped into the circular room filled with portraits of former headmasters. Most of the portraits appeared to be sleeping, but she noticed several sets of painted eyes tracking her movement. She would have to work quickly. Her target was the large cabinet behind Dumbledore's desk, which appeared to contain magical artifacts and documents. When she approached it, however, she felt a strange tingling sensation, as if the air itself was charged with protective magic. She reached out carefully to touch the cabinet door and immediately jerked her hand back. The magical protection hadn't hurt her, but it had shown her something, a brief vision of swirling, a silvery light contained in multiple glass containers within the cabinet. Memory magic. Dumbledore was storing extracted memories in some kind of magical device, preserving the thoughts and experiences of others for his own review and analysis. The implications were staggering. How many of those memories had been taken without consent? How many contained evidence of his strategic sacrifices that he wanted to preserve for future reference? But more disturbing were the darker objects she glimpsed in her brief vision, items that radiated malevolent energy, objects that seemed to pulse with trapped life force. She didn't understand exactly what they were, but something about them reminded her of the sensation she got from the warm book, as if they contained fragments of human souls that had been artificially preserved. The portraits on the walls were beginning to stir, several former headmasters opening painted eyes and looking directly at her. She needed to leave before one of them decided to alert Dumbledore to her presence. But as she turned to go, her eyes fell on a section of the office she hadn't noticed before. A detailed model of Hogwarts that showed not just the official layout, but hidden passages, secret chambers, and rooms that didn't appear on any map. And there, in the deepest part of the castle, was a tiny representation of the archive she had seen marked on Dumbledore's map. The model was enchanted to show real-time activity. As she watched, she could see tiny figures moving through the corridors, students and teachers going about their daily routines. But there were also figures in areas that should have been empty, as in passages that weren't supposed to exist. Watchers. Observers stationed throughout the castle to monitor student activity and report back to Dumbledore. She had been under surveillance from the moment she first entered the restricted section. Every movement, every expression, every sign of discovery had been carefully documented by a network of spies she hadn't even known existed. Fascinating, isn't it? Hermione spun around to find Professor McGonagall standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Professor, I can explain." "Can you?" McGonagall stepped into the office and closed the door behind her with a soft click. "Can you explain why Miss Janet Clearwater appears to be in 2 places at once this evening? Can you explain your unauthorized access to restricted areas of the castle? Or can you explain your sudden interest in historical student deaths?" The partial polyjuice transformation had failed completely, leaving Hermione standing in her own appearance, with no possible excuse for her presence. "I was researching," she said quietly. "Indeed. And what have you discovered in your research, Miss Granger?" McGonagall's tone was carefully neutral, but Hermione caught something in her expression. Not surprise at finding her here, but sadness, as if this confrontation had been expected, even planned. "You already know what I've discovered," Hermione said. "You've been watching me discover it." McGonagall nodded slowly. "The headmaster has been monitoring your progress. Yes. He's quite impressed with your analytical capabilities. He believes you might be suitable for advanced projects. You mean elimination or recruitment?" "I mean a choice," McGonagall said firmly. "The same choice that has been offered to others who discovered uncomfortable truths about the necessities of leadership during wartime." "What choice?" McGonagall walked to the window and looked out over the castle grounds, her expression distant. "Join us willingly, with full understanding of what is required, or continue your current path knowing where it leads. The headmaster is prepared to offer you the first option, because, He recognizes your potential value as an ally rather than simply another necessary casualty. And if I refuse, then you join the names on the memorial wall, and your friends remember you as another victim of the chamber crisis, a tragic accident during a time of great danger. Hermione felt the weight of the choice settling over her like a physical burden. Everything she had learned, all the evidence she had gathered, had led to this moment. Not revelation or justice, but simple complicity or death. I need time to think. Of course, but not too much time. The chamber situation is approaching its resolution, and decisions must be made before that climax arrives. The headmaster will expect your answer within the week. McGonagall moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Miss Granger, I hope you make the wise choice. You're too brilliant to waste, and the war we're fighting requires people of your capabilities. What moral qualms are a luxury we cannot afford when the alternative is the death of everything we're trying to protect. She left Hermione alone in Dumbledore's office, surrounded by evidence of decades of calculated sacrifice and strategic elimination. The portraits on the walls watched her with painted eyes as she stood there, weighing the choice between her conscience and her life. She had 1 week to decide whether to become complicit in Dumbledore's methods or to join the children whose names were written on the memorial wall. Either way, the girl who had entered Hogwarts, believing in the fundamental goodness of those who fought against darkness, was already dead. All that remained was choosing how her story would end. Chapter 8. The Choice to Act. 3 days after McGonagall's ultimatum, Hermione made her choice. She had spent those days maintaining the facade of normalcy, attending classes, helping Harry and Ron with their homework, participating in discussions about the chamber crisis with appropriate concern and interest. To any observer, she appeared to be the same studious, rule-following Gryffindor she had always been. But beneath the surface, she was methodically preparing for war. The decision had crystallized during Defense Against the Dark Arts class, when Professor Lockhart had been pontificating about the heroic choices that defined great wizards throughout history. As she listened to his empty rhetoric about courage and moral clarity, she realized that staying silent, accepting Dumbledore's offer of complicity to save her own life, would make her just another name on his roster of useful assets. She would not become another Timothy Goldstein, eliminated when she became inconvenient. She would not become another McGonagall, complicit in murders because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate, and she would not become another weapon in Dumbledore's arsenal, helping him shape Harry into a willing sacrifice for the greater good. That evening, while her dormmates studied for upcoming exams, Hermione began the careful work of documenting everything she had discovered. She started with the magical book, using every preservation charm she knew to create multiple copies of its contents. The warm volume seemed to resist her efforts at first, its pages flickering between blank parchment and the damning evidence she needed to preserve. But her methodical approach to spell work eventually overcame whatever protections were embedded in its binding. 3 complete copies, each hidden in different locations throughout the castle. One in the abandoned bathroom, where they had been brewing the polyjuice potion, sealed behind a loose stone and protected by notice-me-not charms. One in the room of requirement, though she didn't know its proper name. She had discovered the hidden chamber during her nocturnal investigations and realized it could be convinced to hide her materials. The third she kept with her, concealed in her school bag with a complex illusion charm that made it appear to be her copy of Hogwarts: A History. But magical evidence could be detected and destroyed by someone with Dumbledore's capabilities. She needed mundane documentation as well, physical copies that couldn't be vanished with a simple spell. Late that night, she made her way to the Muggle Studies classroom and used Professor Burbage's photocopier to create paper copies of the most damning documents. The machine struggled with the magical ink, producing images that were faded and sometimes incomplete, but readable enough to serve as evidence. These copies she packaged carefully and prepared for delivery to the outside world. The first package would go to the Daily Prophet, though she held little hope that the wizarding newspaper would publish anything that challenged Dumbledore's reputation. But it would create a paper trail, force questions to be asked, even if they weren't answered publicly. The second package would go to the Ministry of Magic, or addressed to the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Even if most ministry officials were too intimidated by Dumbledore to act on the evidence, someone might be willing to quietly investigate the documented pattern of convenient deaths. The third package was the most important, addressed to Harry Potter himself, to be delivered only if something happened to her. She spent hours crafting the letter that would accompany the evidence, trying to find words that would prepare him for the devastating truth without destroying his ability to function. Dear Harry, if you are reading this, it means I have been eliminated as a security risk. The evidence in this package will explain why. I know this will be difficult to accept. Dumbledore has been like a grandfather to you, the first adult who seemed to truly care about your welfare. But his care is strategic, not personal. You are not his beloved student. You are his weapon, carefully forged through calculated trauma, to be willing to die when he deems it necessary. I don't know if there is another way to defeat Voldemort that doesn't require your sacrifice, but I know you deserve to make that choice with full knowledge of what is being asked of you and why. Don't let them convince you that martyrdom is your only option until you have explored every alternative. Please remember that whatever happens, whatever choices you make, you are loved for who you are, not for your willingness to die for others. You matter beyond your strategic value. You deserve to live. With all my love and hope, Hermione. Writing the letter nearly broke her resolve. The thought of Harry reading those words, and of him learning that everyone he trusted had been manipulating him toward willing suicide, was almost more than she could bear. But the alternative, allowing him to walk blindly into sacrifice, was worse. She sealed the package with magic that would deliver it only upon her death or disappearance, then moved on to the most difficult preparation, deciding how much to tell Harry and Ron before the crisis reached its climax. The Polyjuice potion would be ready in 2 more days. Their plan to infiltrate Slytherin House and question Malfoy about the chamber would proceed as scheduled. But Hermione now understood that the timing was no coincidence. Dumbledore was allowing them to pursue their investigation because it served his purposes, another test of Harry's problem-solving abilities and moral character. She could warn them, could reveal everything she had discovered, and show them the evidence that proved Dumbledore's true nature. But doing so would eliminate any chance of stopping the chamber crisis through conventional means. Worse, it would put Harry and Ron in the same impossible position she now faced, the choice between resistance and complicity. No, she would handle this burden alone until the immediate danger was resolved. Once the chamber situation was over, once students were no longer being petrified, she would tell them everything and face whatever consequences followed. But first, she needed to ensure that the truth would survive even if she didn't. On the 4th night after McGonagall's ultimatum, she returned to the restricted section one final time. The magical book was waiting for her, warm as always, but its pages now showed something different, a real-time update on Dumbledore's surveillance network. Subject Granger has exceeded acceptable response time for recruitment offer. Escalation to elimination protocols authorized effective immediately following resolution of chamber crisis. Use of basilisk attack as cover story approved. Monitoring indicates subject has been creating documentary evidence and preservation copies. Recommend immediate intervention to prevent information dispersal. Note: subject's elimination should coincide with planned Polyjuice investigation. Death during attempt to help friends will reinforce martyrdom conditioning for Potter asset. Hermione felt a cold calm settle over her as she read her own death sentence. They weren't even going to wait for the full week McGonagall had promised. They planned to kill her during the Polyjuice investigation, making her death serve the dual purpose of eliminating a security risk and providing additional trauma for Harry's conditioning. But their surveillance hadn't been as complete as they thought. They knew she had created copies of evidence, but they didn't know where all of them were hidden. They assumed she would continue to follow their timeline for the chamber investigation, but they didn't know she was now acting with full knowledge of their intentions. She had one advantage. They expected her to behave like a frightened child, paralyzed by the scope of the conspiracy against her. They didn't expect her to act like the brilliant strategist she had always been when faced with impossible problems. She opened the book to a section she had never seen before and began to write. To whoever finds this record after my death, my name is Hermione Jean Granger. I am 12 years old. I have discovered evidence that Albus Dumbledore has been orchestrating the deaths of students and resistance members for over 50 years, sacrificing individuals he deems expendable for what he calls the greater good. The evidence is hidden in 3 locations within Hogwarts Castle. The preservation charms will ensure it survives, even if I do not. Use this information wisely. The wizarding world deserves to know the truth about the man they trust with their children's lives. I am not a hero. I am a child who stumbled upon terrible knowledge and chose to preserve it rather than pretend ignorance. If that choice costs me my life, so be it. Some truths are worth dying for. But if you are reading this, please remember, I was not killed by Voldemort or his servants. I was eliminated by the man the wizarding world believes is their greatest protector, because I threatened his ability to sacrifice others for his strategic purposes. Harry Potter is next. Save him if you can. HJG, December 1992. She sealed the entry with magic that would preserve it permanently, then closed the book and stood in the quiet, restricted section for what she knew might be the last time. Tomorrow, they would drink the polyjuice potion and attempt to question Malfoy about the chamber. Dumbledore's agents would be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to stage her accidental death. But they expected her to follow their script, to play her assigned role as an unwitting victim. Instead, she would be ready. She had spent weeks documenting Dumbledore's crimes. Now she would spend her remaining time ensuring those crimes were exposed, whatever the cost to herself. The frightened child who had discovered the truth about the wizarding world's greatest hero was gone. In her place stood someone harder, older, willing to make the same impossible choices that had defined her enemy. Except her choices would serve justice rather than convenient strategy. If Hermione Granger was going to die for the greater good, she would ensure that her death actually served a greater good, rather than simply eliminating an inconvenient witness. The war between Dumbledore and Voldemort would continue after she was gone, but it would no longer be fought solely on Dumbledore's terms, with his carefully managed sacrifices and strategic eliminations. She had lit a fuse that would eventually expose him for what he truly was. Whether that revelation came too late to save Harry or the wizarding world remained to be seen. But the truth would survive, even if its messenger did not. And sometimes the survival of truth was enough to justify any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of a 12-year-old girl who had simply wanted to protect her friends from the monsters who wore the faces of heroes. Walking back to Gryffindor Tower through corridors that might soon witness her death, Hermione felt something she hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Peace. Not because she had found a way to save everyone she loved, but because she had finally found a way to ensure that their choices, whatever they might be, would be made with knowledge rather than manipulation. In the end, thought that might be the only victory available to her, but it would have to be enough. Chapter 9. Racing Against Time. The Polyjuice investigation had failed spectacularly, and Ginny Weasley was gone. Hermione sat in the hospital wing, her head bandaged from where she'd been knocked unconscious during their retreat from the Slytherin common room. Malfoy's shocked denial about the chamber, his genuine fear when he realized students might actually die, had proven he wasn't the heir of Slytherin they'd been seeking. Worse, while they'd been pursuing their misguided investigation, the real perpetrator had taken Ron's sister into the chamber itself. The message on the corridor wall had been brutally direct. Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever. Harry and Ron sat beside her bed, their faces hollow with guilt and desperation, as they blamed themselves for wasting time on Malfoy while Ginny was taken. They didn't know, couldn't know, that their investigation had been allowed to proceed because it served Dumbledore's purposes, another test of Harry's problem-solving abilities and moral development. But Hermione knew, and the knowledge was tearing her apart. "We have to find her," Harry said for the 100th time, his voice raw with determination. "There has to be a way into the chamber, some clue we missed." "The teachers are searching," Ron whispered, though his tone suggested he had little faith in their success. "Lockhart's supposed to rescue her. He's the defense teacher. He should know about this stuff." Hermione almost laughed at the bitter irony. Lockhart was a fraud, as she'd suspected since October. Or the teachers weren't going to save Ginny because they weren't supposed to. This was Harry's test, his opportunity to prove he would risk everything to save others. Dumbledore was counting on Harry's hero complex to drive him into the chamber, where he would face Tom Riddle and demonstrate the precise combination of courage, sacrifice, and moral conviction necessary for his eventual willing death. Every part of the crisis had been orchestrated. Ginny's possession by the diary, her increasing weakness as Tom Riddle grew stronger, even the timing of her final abduction. It was all designed to create the perfect conditions for testing Harry's character under pressure. And Hermione was supposed to play her part, provide the crucial research that would allow Harry to understand what he was facing, or then step aside so he could face the danger alone. The problem was that stepping aside might mean letting Ginny die. She had spent weeks documenting Dumbledore's willingness to sacrifice children for strategic purposes. She had seen the names of dozens of young people who had died because their deaths served the greater good. She had even discovered evidence that he had planned Harry's entire childhood trauma to shape him into a willing martyr. But Ginny Weasley was 11 years old, possessed by a fragment of Voldemort's soul, dying alone in the Chamber of Secrets, while the adults who were supposed to protect her followed a script designed to test someone else's character development. Some moral choices were too simple for strategic complexity. Hermione rose from her hospital bed, ignoring Madame Pomfrey's protests, and made her way to the library with Harry and Ron trailing behind her. She had work to do. The research came together quickly once she focused on the right questions. She had been investigating the chamber crisis for months, but always as part of her broader inquiry into Dumbledore's methods. Now, concentrating solely on saving Ginny, the pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The monster was a basilisk, a giant serpent that killed with direct eye contact and petrified through indirect viewing. Tom Riddle had controlled it 50 years ago during his student years, using it to kill Myrtle Warren, while Dumbledore allowed the attacks to continue for intelligence-gathering purposes. Now the pattern was repeating, with Ginny as the unwitting agent and Harry as the intended hero. But there were details in her research that Harry would need to survive the encounter. Information about the basilisk's weaknesses, the nature of Tom Riddle's diary, the specific magical protections that might shield Harry from the serpent's deadly gaze. She could provide that information, could give Harry every advantage she had discovered through her weeks of investigation, could stack the odds in favor of his survival and Ginny's rescue. The question was whether doing so would make her complicit in Dumbledore's manipulation. As she sat in the library, copying crucial passages about basilisks onto parchment, she realized she was facing the same impossible choice that had defined every adult who worked with Dumbledore: sacrifice individual moral purity to serve a larger strategic purpose. If she refused to help, if she withheld the research that could save Ginny's life, she would be guilty of the same calculated cruelty she had condemned in Dumbledore's records. She would be choosing ideological purity over the life of a child. But if she provided the information, she would be enabling Dumbledore's test, participating in the conditioning process designed to prepare Harry for willing sacrifice. She would be helping to create the trauma and hero complex that would eventually drive him to his planned death. There was no moral high ground, only the choice between different forms of complicity. She chose Ginny. Working through the night, she compiled everything Harry would need to know: the basilisk's method of travel through the castle's plumbing, or the significance of the diary as a conduit for Tom Riddle's preserved consciousness, the protective power of Phoenix Song against the serpent's deadly gaze, even the specific incantation that could destroy the diary and break its hold on Ginny. But she couldn't simply hand Harry a complete guide to surviving the chamber. That would be too obvious, too inconsistent with her role as the brilliant student who provided research support rather than strategic planning. She needed to present the information in a way that would lead Harry to the right conclusions without making her own knowledge suspicious. The solution came to her as she remembered Timothy Goldstein, the student who had been killed for discovering the memorial wall and trying to warn others about Dumbledore's crimes. She would do what Timothy had tried to do, leave clues that revealed the truth, but in a way that appeared to be coincidental discovery rather than deliberate revelation. She tore the page about basilisks from Most Potente Potions, a book she had legitimately been consulting for their polyjuice research. On the margins of the page, she wrote careful annotations that would guide Harry toward the crucial realizations he needed to save both himself and Ginny. Pipes. How it moves unseen. Spiders flee. They fear it above all other creatures. Rooster crow is fatal to basilisk eyes. Indirect gaze petrifies, direct gaze kills. But she also included information that had nothing to do with basilisks, details that might someday help Harry understand the larger conspiracy he was trapped within. Or Tom Marvolo riddle, I am Lord Voldemort diary stores memories. Fragment of soul. Ginny taken for reason, not random victim AD knows more than he admits. Check his past. She folded the page carefully and placed it in her copy of Most Potente Potions, then opened the book to that section and left it on the library table where Harry and Ron would find it after her petrification. Because she was going to be petrified. She had read enough of Dumbledore's strategic planning to understand that her removal from the crisis was essential for Harry's test to proceed properly. She was too intelligent, too analytical, too likely to solve problems through research rather than heroic action. For Harry to develop the necessary willingness to risk everything alone, his support system had to be eliminated at the crucial moment, or the basilisk would find her in the library, and she would be petrified while apparently researching ways to help her friends. Her elimination would serve multiple purposes. It would remove her questions about Dumbledore's methods, provide additional motivation for Harry's rescue mission, and reinforce his growing pattern of losing people he cared about to forces beyond his control. But she could control one element of her petrification: the timing. She had prepared everything Harry would need to save Ginny. She had hidden copies of evidence that would eventually expose Dumbledore's crimes. She had written letters that would reveal the truth if her elimination was permanent rather than temporary. Now she needed to ensure that her petrification occurred at the precise moment when it would do the most good and the least harm. Too early, and Harry might give up hope. Too late, and Ginny might die before he could reach her. She waited until she heard footsteps in the corridor, Ginny being taken to the chamber, most likely, or the message being written on the wall to announce her abduction. Then she positioned herself at the library table, opened the book to the basilisk page, and raised the small mirror she had borrowed from her dormitory. The basilisk's reflection appeared in the mirror just as she had calculated, its ancient eyes meeting hers through the silvered surface. She felt the petrifying magic wash over her, freezing her body in place while her mind remained terrifyingly active. But as the magic took hold, something unexpected happened. The warm book, still hidden in her school bag under multiple concealment charms, began to pulse with energy, and suddenly she could see more than just the library around her. She could see the memorial wall, its names glowing with spectral light. She could see Timothy Goldstein reaching toward her across the decades, his expression grateful that someone had finally continued his interrupted work. She could see Sarah Clearwater and Marcus Belby and all the others, the children who had died because they discovered inconvenient truths. "Thank you," Timothy whispered, though no sound reached her frozen ears. "For remembering us, for refusing to let our deaths be meaningless." "The evidence will survive," Sarah added, her ghostly hand touching the preserved documents Hermione had hidden throughout the castle. "Others will find it. Others will ask the questions we couldn't finish asking." "And the Potter boy?" Marcus asked, his expression worried. "Will he survive what's planned for him?" Hermione tried to answer, but her petrified state allowed no speech. She could only watch as the spectral children gathered around her, their faces reflecting both hope and determination. "He'll have choices we never had," she thought toward them, hoping they could sense her intention. "Because of what we've preserved, he'll know the truth before it's too late." The vision faded as footsteps approached the library. Harry and Ron's voices, frantic with worry about Ginny and desperate for any clue that might help them save her. They would find her here, petrified, but still pointing the way toward the answers they needed. And in her bag, hidden but not destroyed, lay evidence that would eventually give Harry the choice she had never been able to offer him directly, the chance to understand his true situation before walking into the trap designed to claim his life. As consciousness faded into the grey stillness of petrification, Hermione felt something she had never expected. Satisfaction. She had played her assigned role in Dumbledore's test. She had provided the research Harry needed to save Ginny. She had been eliminated at the precise moment her absence would motivate rather than discourage. But she had also planted seeds that would eventually expose the puppet master behind the performance. The evidence would survive, the questions would be asked, and the truth would emerge. Harry Potter would face his destiny, but he would face it with knowledge rather than manipulation, or choice rather than conditioning, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to save him from the sacrifice Dumbledore had planned since the day he was born. The last thing she felt before the petrification claimed her completely was the warm book pulsing one final time, its magic reaching out to touch the boy who would soon risk everything to save a friend. "Be safe," she thought toward Harry, though he could not hear her. "Be wise. And when the time comes to choose, remember that you are loved for more than your willingness to die." Then grey stillness claimed her, and Hermione Granger became another casualty in the war between truth and necessity, though not in the way anyone expected. Chapter 10. Recovery and Resolve. The first thing Hermione saw when the Mandrake draft lifted the petrification was Harry's face, hollow with exhaustion and trauma, trying to smile as she sat up in the hospital wing bed. "You're awake," he said, and his voice carried relief so profound it made her chest ache. "We were so worried. You've been petrified for weeks." "Ginny?" The question came out as a croak, her throat raw from the long, magical stasis. "Safe," Ron answered from her other side, though his expression remained haunted. "Harry saved her, killed the basilisk, destroyed the diary. It's over." But as Hermione looked around the hospital wing, at the other beds where petrified students were slowly awakening, at Harry's trembling hands, at the way Ron couldn't quite meet her eyes, she understood that while the chamber crisis might be over, the larger horror she had uncovered was just beginning its next phase. "Tell me everything," she said softly. Was accepting the glass of water, Madame Pumphrey pressed into her hands. The story they told her should have filled her with relief and gratitude. Harry had solved the riddle of the chamber, followed the basilisk into its lair, and faced Tom Riddle himself. Not just a memory preserved in an enchanted diary, but a manifestation of the Dark Lord's younger self, fed by Ginny's life force until he was nearly corporeal. The battle had been desperate. Harry, armed only with Dumbledore's phoenix forks and the sword of Gryffindor that had mysteriously appeared in the Sorting Hat had fought a 1,000-year-old basilisk and won. Fawkes had blinded the serpent and healed Harry's wounds, while the sword, imbued with basilisk venom, had destroyed the diary and Tom Riddle's preserved consciousness. Ginny had been dying, her life drained away to feed Tom Riddle's return, but destroying the diary had broken the connection, allowing her to recover and return to her family. It was a story of heroism triumphing over darkness, of love conquering evil, of impossible courage saving the innocent. It was also, Hermione realized with growing horror, exactly the scenario Dumbledore had planned from the beginning. Where was Dumbledore during all of this? She asked quietly. The Board of Governors had him removed, Harry explained, but he came back as soon as it was over. He said he'd never really left, that he only went into hiding until Hogwarts called him back. And Fawkes? How did the Phoenix know to find you in the chamber? Harry's face brightened slightly. Dumbledore said phoenixes are drawn to loyalty and courage, and Fawkes came because he sensed I needed help. And the hat. Dumbledore explained that it will always provide aid to any true Gryffindor who asks for it. Each detail made Hermione's stomach clench tighter. The phoenix that had appeared at precisely the right moment. The sword that had materialized exactly when Harry needed a weapon capable of destroying the diary. The convenient removal of Dumbledore that had forced Harry to handle the crisis alone, building his confidence and hero complex. None of it had been coincidence. All of it had been carefully orchestrated to provide Harry with a manageable but traumatic test of his willingness to risk everything for others. "Did Dumbledore say anything else about the diary?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "He seemed really interested in how Tom Riddle had preserved himself in it," Ron said. "Asked a lot of questions about what the diary felt like, how it controlled Ginny, what happened when Harry stabbed it with the basilisk fang." "He said it was very dark magic," Harry added, "the kind that requires terrible sacrifices to achieve. He wants to research it more, to understand how Voldemort could have created such a thing." Hermione nodded, but inside she was remembering the artifacts she had glimpsed in Dumbledore's office, objects that pulsed with trapped life force that reminded her of the diary's malevolent energy. Dumbledore wasn't researching Tom Riddle's methods to better understand his enemy. He was studying them to perfect his own techniques for preserving consciousness and manipulating souls. Over the next few days, as she recovered her strength and returned to classes, she observed the aftermath of the chamber crisis with new eyes. Everything confirmed what she had learned during her weeks of investigation. Dumbledore's genius lay not just in strategic planning, but in making his manipulations appear to be natural consequences of other people's choices. She watched him comfort Ginny in the Great Hall, his grandfatherly concern evident to everyone around them. But Hermione could see the calculation underneath, the way he guided the conversation to understand exactly how the diary had influenced her thoughts, how Tom Riddle's memories had interacted with her own consciousness. He wasn't comforting a traumatized child. He was debriefing a test subject. She observed his conversations with Harry were filled with warm praise for the boy's courage and wisdom. But every word was designed to reinforce the lessons Dumbledore wanted Harry to learn. That sacrifice for others was the highest virtue, that facing impossible odds alone was noble rather than foolish, that trusting in love and loyalty would always provide salvation. He was programming Harry's responses to future crises, building the psychological framework that would eventually lead him to willing self-sacrifice. The most heartbreaking moment came when she overheard Harry speaking to McGonagall about the events in the chamber. "I was so scared," he admitted quietly. "But I kept thinking about what Dumbledore would do. He always knows the right choice to make, even when it's difficult. I tried to be brave like him." McGonagall's expression was pained, and for a moment Hermione thought she might see through the manipulation that was shaping her students' moral development. But then she smiled and patted Harry's shoulder. "Professor Dumbledore would be proud of the choices you made," she said gently. You showed the same wisdom and courage that makes him such a great leader. The casual reinforcement of Dumbledore's authority, the subtle suggestion that Harry's heroism was somehow derivative of his mentor's guidance. It was masterful conditioning disguised as simple encouragement. But the conversation that crystallized Hermione's resolve came 3 days after her recovery, when she found Harry sitting alone by the lake, staring out over the water with an expression of profound exhaustion. "I keep thinking about Ginny dying in the chamber," he said, without looking at her. "How close I came to being too late. If Fawkes hadn't come, if the hat hadn't given me the sword." "But they did," Hermione said softly, settling beside him on the grass. "Because I was lucky." "But what about next time? What if there's another crisis and I'm not lucky enough? What if I can't save everyone who needs saving?" The weight of manufactured responsibility in his voice was devastating. At 12 years old, Harry Potter had been conditioned to believe that other people's survival was his personal obligation, that failure to save everyone would be a moral failure on his part. "Harry," she said carefully, "you can't save everyone. No one can. Even adults with years of training and powerful magic can't prevent every tragedy." "Dumbledore does," Harry said with quiet conviction. "He always knows what to do. He saved me from the Dursleys. He's protecting Hogwarts. He defeated Grindelwald. Maybe someday I'll be strong enough to help people the way he does." The innocent faith in his voice nearly broke her heart. Harry wasn't just being prepared for sacrifice. He was being taught to see sacrifice as the ultimate expression of love and wisdom. When the time came for him to die, he wouldn't just do it willingly. He would do it gratefully, believing it was the same kind of noble choice Dumbledore had made throughout his long career. That night, alone in her dormitory while her roommate slept, Hermione retrieved the magical book from its hiding place. The warm binding pulsed against her palms as she opened it to a section she had never seen before. To Post-Crisis Assessment, Potter Asset Development. The chamber incident has exceeded all projected outcomes for character conditioning. Subject demonstrated optimal balance of strategic thinking and emotional engagement, by solving the mystery through analysis while responding to the crisis through personal sacrifice rather than seeking adult assistance. Key achievements. Subject prioritized rescue of vulnerable individual over personal safety. Subject accepted life-threatening mission without external coercion. Subject's success reinforced belief in destiny and exceptional capability. Subject's trauma has deepened emotional attachment to protecting others. Subject's trust in authority figures has been strengthened through apparent divine intervention. Recommendations for next phase. Continue pattern of escalating challenges requiring personal sacrifice. Introduce additional traumatic losses to reinforce theme that caring about others leads to pain. Maintain strategic distance while providing precisely calibrated support to suggest supernatural protection. Begin introducing concept of ultimate sacrifice as natural progression of current heroic pattern. Timeline. Subject now demonstrates 73% probability of willing compliance with termination directive when presented appropriately. Recommend acceleration of conditioning program to achieve 90% plus compliance within 3 to 4 years. Hermione closed the book with steady hands, though her heart was pounding. The chamber crisis hadn't just been a test of Harry's character, it had been a calibration of his psychological conditioning, and according to Dumbledore's assessment, it had been remarkably successful. But there was something else in the report that gave her hope. The timeline. 3 to 4 years before, Harry would be considered ready for termination directive. That meant she had time to work, a time to plant seeds of doubt and critical thinking that might counter Dumbledore's conditioning. The evidence she had hidden throughout the castle was still intact. The letters she had written would still be delivered if something happened to her. And now she had something more, specific intelligence about Dumbledore's timeline and methods. She opened the book to a blank page and began to write. To Harry Potter, to be revealed when he is mature enough to understand. You are being prepared for sacrifice. The man you trust as a grandfather sees you as a strategic asset whose death will serve his purposes. Every kindness he shows you, every protection he provides, it is designed to make you willing to die when he determines the time is right. I cannot tell you this directly, because the knowledge would destroy you before you are strong enough to use it. But someday, when you are older and facing the choice between life and death, remember that you are valued for more than your willingness to sacrifice yourself. The evidence of Dumbledore's true nature is hidden throughout Hogwarts. When you are ready to see it, the truth will find you. Until then, live, love, make friends, experience joy, build a life worth fighting for, not just a death worth dying for. With all my love and faith in your strength, Hermione Granger. She sealed the entry with magic that would reveal it only when Harry reached his 5th year at Hogwarts, old enough to process the devastating truth without being paralyzed by it, but still young enough to have time to prepare for whatever choice he would eventually face. The girl who had entered the chamber crisis, believing in the fundamental goodness of those who fought against darkness, was gone. In her place sat someone harder, older, with a clear understanding of the war being fought for Harry Potter's soul. Dumbledore had won this battle, successfully conditioning Harry to see heroic sacrifice as love made manifest. But the war for Harry's agency, for his right to choose his own fate with full knowledge, was far from over. Hermione Granger had work to do, and this time she would not be working alone. But the evidence would survive, the questions would be asked, and when Harry Potter stood at the crossroads between life and death, he would have more options than the ones Dumbledore had prepared for him. The truth was patient. It would wait as long as necessary for its moment to emerge, and when that moment came, Hermione would be ready. Chapter 11. Gathering Allies. 3 weeks into the new term, Hermione began the delicate work of testing potential allies. She had spent the Christmas holidays formulating her approach with methodical precision. Direct confrontation was impossible. Dumbledore's surveillance network would detect any overt attempt to expose his methods. But subtle probes, careful questions, and strategic placement of doubts might identify others who shared her growing concerns about the headmaster's true nature. Or the first person she approached was Professor McGonagall, though she had little hope of success after their conversation in Dumbledore's office. "Professor," she said, after a transfiguration lesson, lingering as other students filed out, "I've been thinking about the chamber crisis, about how many students were put in danger while the adults searched for solutions." McGonagall's expression became guarded instantly. "The crisis was resolved as quickly as possible, Miss Granger. The faculty did everything within their power to protect students." "Of course," Hermione said quickly. "I just wondered. Well, in my research, I noticed that similar crises have occurred throughout Hogwarts' history. Students dying or disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Have there ever been discussions about whether some of those incidents could have been prevented with different approaches?" The silence that followed was telling. McGonagall's face went through a series of subtle expressions: recognition, pain, and finally, resignation. "Miss Granger," she said quietly, "there are aspects of educational administration that students are not equipped to understand. Decisions that appear callous from a child's perspective serve necessary purposes that become clear only with experience and wisdom. Even when those decisions involve children dying?" McGonagall flinched as if struck. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something raw and haunted underneath. "Especially then," she whispered, "because the alternative, allowing greater evils to prevail through inaction, would result in far more deaths. Sometimes the most moral choice feels monstrous in the moment." She turned away, busying herself with organizing papers on her desk. "You should focus on your studies, Miss Granger. Trust that the adults responsible for your safety are making the best decisions possible with the information available to them. The conversation told Hermione everything she needed to know. McGonagall was aware of Dumbledore's methods and had made peace with them through rationalization and compartmentalization. She might feel guilty about specific decisions, but she wouldn't act against the system that required them. Her next approach was more oblique. During a potions class, she began a casual conversation with Severus Snape about historical dark arts research, hoping to gauge his knowledge of Dumbledore's activities. "Professor Snape," she said, as she ground beetle eyes for her strengthening solution. "During my research about the chamber incident, I found references to experimental magic involving soul preservation. Tom Riddle's diary seemed to use techniques that weren't well documented in standard texts." Snape's hands stilled over his own ingredient preparation. "And what conclusion have you drawn from this observation, Miss Granger?" "I wondered if there might be other examples of such magic being studied at Hogwarts, for defensive purposes, of course, where understanding how such techniques work would help in developing countermeasures." The potions master's black eyes studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "The study of soul magic is among the most dangerous pursuits in the wizarding world, Miss Granger. Those who delve too deeply into such research risk corruption of their own magical essence. It is not a subject suitable for curious students. But surely someone with sufficient expertise and moral grounding could research it safely? Someone like Professor Dumbledore, perhaps?" Snape's expression became unreadable. "Professor Dumbledore's research interests are his own concern. I suggest you focus on mastering basic potion making before concerning yourself with advanced magical theory." The conversation ended there, but Hermione had seen enough. Snape knew something about Dumbledore's research into soul magic, and his careful neutrality suggested either complicity or fear of speaking openly. Either way, he wouldn't be an ally in exposing the truth. Her efforts with fellow students proved more promising, though also more dangerous. She started with 7th-year students who would have known some of the victims she had documented in her research. Marcus Flint's older brother had been friends with Timothy Goldstein. Sarah Abbott's cousin had been in the same year as Marcus Belby. "I'm doing research for a memorial project," she told Sarah Abbott during a study session in the library, "trying to honor students who died at Hogwarts over the years. I noticed your cousin knew Marcus Belby, who died in 1963. Do you know anything about what he was researching before his death?" Sarah's face went pale. "Marcus? But the family always said he died in an accident with experimental potions." "He did," Hermione said carefully. "But I found some of his research notes in old library books. He seemed to be investigating historical inconsistencies in the school records. I thought it might be interesting to understand what questions he was asking." I don't think I should talk about that," Sarah said, glancing around nervously. "My parents said the family doesn't discuss Marcus anymore. Something about not wanting to reopen old wounds." But she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Though my aunt did mention once that Marcus had been asking uncomfortable questions about students who had died during the chamber incident 50 years ago. She said he thought there might have been cover-ups, official stories that didn't match what really happened." The conversation confirmed what Hermione already suspected. Families of victims had been discouraged from asking questions, either through direct intimidation or subtle social pressure. The pattern of silence around suspicious deaths wasn't accidental. Her most ambitious attempt involved reaching out beyond Hogwarts entirely. She had observed Rita Skeeter's ruthless journalism during the Quidditch World Cup coverage in Old Prophet issues, and realized that the reporter's hunger for scandal might be turned to useful purposes. Using Owlpost from Hogsmeade during a weekend trip, she sent an anonymous letter to the Daily Prophet offices. "Miss Skeeter, I write to inform you of a story that could define your career. Systematic cover-ups of student deaths at Hogwarts School spanning over 50 years. I possess documented evidence of administrative decisions that prioritized strategic considerations over student safety, resulting in preventable casualties. The records show a pattern of calculated sacrifice designed to serve long-term goals while maintaining the public facade of child protection. If you are interested in investigating this matter, place an advertisement in the Prophet Classifieds reading, "Historical Research Consultant Needed, Experience with Educational Records Preferred," and I will provide you with evidence that will expose the truth behind Hogwarts's carefully maintained reputation. A concerned citizen who believes children deserve better protection than they currently receive. She sealed the letter carefully and sent it with an untraceable school owl, knowing that Skeeter's reputation for exposing scandals might overcome any reluctance to challenge Dumbledore's authority. The response came a week later, a small classified advertisement that matched her specified wording exactly. But before she could arrange to provide evidence to Skeeter, a conversation with Arthur Weasley during a weekend visit to the Burrow changed her entire approach. She had intended to probe the Ministry employee about corruption in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, hoping to understand why official investigations of suspicious deaths were consistently inconclusive. But when she carefully raised the subject, Arthur's response stopped her cold. "Oh, you've been reading about those old cases," he said with a sad smile. "I remember when I first started at the Ministry, I was assigned to review some of those files. Terrible tragedies, all of them. But what really struck me was how thoroughly they had been investigated." Thoroughly. Professor Dumbledore personally oversaw many of those investigations, Arthur explained. Spent hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, ensuring that every possible angle was explored. And the man's dedication to student safety is remarkable. I've seen him work through the night to understand how tragedies occurred, always looking for ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. Dumbledore hadn't just covered up the investigations, he had personally conducted them, ensuring that the official conclusions would support whatever narrative served his purposes. "The only tragedy," Arthur continued, "is that despite all his efforts, some accidents simply can't be prevented. Magic is dangerous, and children are naturally curious about things they don't understand. But knowing that someone like Dumbledore is watching over them, well, it helps parents sleep better at night." The conversation revealed the true scope of Dumbledore's influence. He wasn't just manipulating events within Hogwarts, he had cultivated a network of trust throughout the wizarding world that made questioning his decisions nearly impossible. Any investigation into suspicious deaths would be conducted by people who already believed in his essential goodness and wisdom. That evening, back in her dormitory, Hermione reviewed her attempts at building alliances with growing despair. McGonagall was complicit but conflicted. Snape was either complicit or too afraid to speak. Students who might have knowledge had been silenced through family pressure. Ministry officials trusted Dumbledore to investigate his own potential crimes, and even journalists like Rita Skeeter would face enormous pressure to suppress any story that challenged the wizarding world's most beloved figure. The conspiracy protecting Dumbledore wasn't maintained through active malice. It was sustained by genuine affection and trust. People wanted to believe in his goodness because the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. They participated in cover-ups not because they were evil, but because they couldn't bear to destroy their faith in the one man who represented everything noble about the fight against darkness. She opened the magical book to document her findings, but found herself staring at a new entry that made her stomach clench with recognition. Security assessment. Granger asset. Probing activities. Subject has initiated contact with multiple individuals in apparent attempt to identify potential allies for resistance activities. Surveillance indicates systematic approach to testing loyalty and knowledge among faculty, students, and external contacts. Response. All contacted individuals have reported interactions to security network as trained. No security breaches detected. Subject's activities serve useful intelligence gathering purposes, by identifying potential future risks. Recommendation: continue monitoring but take no direct action. Subject's isolation is now complete. She has demonstrated to herself that no allies are available. This realization will either break her resistance entirely or drive her to more desperate measures that can be easily countered. Note: subject's anonymous contact with Skeeter has been intercepted and redirected. False classified response will lead to exposure of her activities if she attempts follow-through. Hermione closed the book with trembling hands. Every conversation she had initiated, but every careful probe, every attempt to identify potential allies, all of it had been reported back to Dumbledore's network. The people she had hoped to recruit as allies had instead become unwitting tools in his surveillance of her activities. She was completely alone, surrounded by people who either actively supported Dumbledore's methods or were too afraid to question them. Worse, her attempts to build resistance had only strengthened his intelligence about her capabilities and intentions. But as she sat in the darkness of her dormitory, listening to her roommates sleep peacefully nearby, Hermione realized something that the surveillance report had missed. She had never expected to find allies who were willing to actively oppose Dumbledore. What she had been looking for, and what she had found, was evidence of how completely his influence controlled the wizarding world. Understanding the scope of his power was just as valuable as identifying weaknesses in it. She couldn't build an active resistance movement, but she could ensure that when the time came for truth to emerge, it would find fertile ground among people who had already been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the gap between Dumbledore's reputation and his actions. McGonagall's guilt, Snape's careful neutrality, the silenced families of victims, the ministry officials who trusted too completely, all of them were seeds that might eventually grow into doubt when presented with undeniable evidence. She couldn't save Harry by gathering an army to oppose Dumbledore, but she might be able to save him by ensuring that when he finally faced the choice between life and death, he wouldn't be completely alone in questioning the wisdom of those who claimed to love him. Sometimes, the most valuable allies were not those who fought alongside you, but those who refused to stand completely against you when the truth finally demanded recognition. It would have to be enough. Chapter 12. The Memorial. On a warm evening in late May, as the school year drew to a close, Hermione returned to the restricted section for the final time. She had spent the past months maintaining the careful balance she had learned was essential to her survival, excelling in her classes, supporting Harry and Ron with their adventures and concerns, participating in the normal rhythms of second-year life. To anyone watching, she was the same brilliant, helpful friend she had always been, perhaps slightly quieter than before, but still fundamentally unchanged by her encounter with the chamber crisis. No one could see the weight she carried, the names that echoed in her dreams, or the terrible knowledge that colored every interaction with the adults who claimed to protect them. But tonight, she had work to finish. The magical book was waiting for her in its usual location, warm to the touch and thrumming with preserved memories. When she opened it, the pages showed not surveillance reports or strategic assessments, but the memorial wall she had discovered months ago, the names of children who had died because Dumbledore deemed their deaths acceptable losses. She had come to honor them properly. Working by wandlight in the quiet library, Hermione began the careful process of preserving their stories permanently. Using every advanced charm she had learned through months of desperate research, she created multiple preservation matrices that would protect the evidence from destruction, alteration, or concealment. The first layer was simple physical protection, charms that would prevent the books and documents from being burned, vanished, or magically altered. The second layer was more complex, temporal preservation that would restore the evidence even if it was temporarily destroyed. The third layer was the most sophisticated, a dispersal charm that would scatter copies of the most crucial evidence throughout the wizarding world if anyone attempted to eliminate the original sources. But the most important preservation was Memorial itself. She turned to a blank section of the book and began to write, not as the desperate child who had stumbled upon these secrets, but as the careful historian she had become. In memory of those who died for the greater good, a record by H.J. Granger, witness to truth. These are the names of children and young people who died not in battle against dark forces, but as calculated sacrifices in a war fought by those who claimed to love them. They died because adults who held power decided their lives were worth less than strategic advantage. They died because someone determined that their deaths would serve a greater good. But their deaths served no good at all. They served only the ambition of a man who learned to justify murder by calling it necessity. She began with the earliest names she had found, and children from Dumbledore's youth who had died during his partnership with Grindelwald. She recorded not just their names and ages, but what she had learned about their personalities, their hopes, their families, who mourned them without ever knowing why they truly died. Thomas Morrison, age 8, died 1899. Loved flying toy broomsticks and wanted to play professional Quidditch. Killed because his Muggle neighbors witnessed magic and Dumbledore deemed elimination more efficient than memory modification. Eliza Hartwell, age 11, died 1900. Exceptionally bright, already showing signs of advanced magical ability. Killed because her death provided intelligence about dark curse effects that Dumbledore wanted to study. She continued through the decades, or giving each victim the dignity of being remembered as a person rather than a strategic calculation. By the time she reached the more recent deaths, Timothy Goldstein, Sarah Clearwater, Marcus Belby, her cheeks were wet with tears, but her handwriting remained steady. Timothy Goldstein, age 17, died 1976, brilliant researcher who discovered evidence of systematic elimination of students who asked uncomfortable questions, tried to warn others about the pattern of deaths, eliminated because truth was inconvenient. He deserved to live. He deserved to grow up, to use his intelligence for good purposes, to love and be loved. He died because he was brave enough to speak truth to power. We failed him. We failed all of them. When she finished the memorial entries, she created a preservation charm more complex than anything she had attempted before. One that would ensure these names and stories could never be completely erased, no matter what happened to the physical books or the magical artifacts that contained them. The charm drew power from the collective grief and anger she felt for these forgotten victims, weaving their memory into the very fabric of magic itself. As long as injustice existed in the world, as long as children needed protection from those who would sacrifice them for abstract causes, these names would persist in the magical consciousness, waiting to be rediscovered by future generations who might learn from past failures. Next, she turned her attention to the mechanisms that would eventually expose Dumbledore's true nature to the wizarding world. She had learned from her failed attempts to find immediate allies that direct confrontation was impossible. Too many people loved and trusted Dumbledore for accusations to be believed without overwhelming evidence presented at precisely the right moment. But she could create conditions that would ensure the truth would eventually emerge when the wizarding world was ready to hear it. The first mechanism was temporal, evidence caches that would activate and become discoverable when certain conditions were met. If Harry Potter died under suspicious circumstances, if students began disappearing in patterns similar to historical incidents, as if Dumbledore's public statements began contradicting documented private positions, any of these triggers would cause hidden evidence to surface in locations where it would be found by people capable of understanding its significance. The second mechanism was personal, protections for herself and the knowledge she carried. Memory charms that would restore her recollections if anyone attempted to modify them. Automated evidence releases that would activate if she died or disappeared. Letters to be delivered to specific individuals if she failed to prevent them on scheduled dates. The third mechanism was the most ambitious. A magical construct that would preserve not just the facts she had discovered, but the moral reasoning behind her conclusions. Future investigators would inherit not just evidence, but the ethical framework necessary to understand why these revelations mattered and what choices they created. As she worked through the night, weaving complex magic that pushed the boundaries of her capabilities, Hermione felt something she had not experienced since before her discovery of Dumbledore's crimes: peace. Not because the burden was lifted, she would carry the weight of these secrets for the rest of her life, however long that might be, but because she had found a way to honor the victims while protecting the people she loved from knowledge that would destroy them before they were strong enough to use it. Harry would face his destiny eventually. She could not prevent that confrontation or change the fundamental dynamics that drove it. But when the time came for him to choose between life and death, he would have access to information that might help him make that choice on his own terms rather than according to someone else's script. The memorial wall would remember those who had died in shadows. The preservation charms would protect evidence from destruction. The trigger mechanisms would ensure truth could not be buried forever, and she would return to her life as Hermione Granger, brightest witch of her age, loyal friend to Harry Potter and Ron Weasley, dedicated student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Most people lived their entire lives without stumbling upon truths that could shatter their world's foundations. She was 13 years old, and she had already learned that heroes could be monsters, that love could be manipulation, and that the adults trusted to protect children were often the greatest threats to their safety. But she had also learned that truth was patient, that courage could exist in small acts as well as grand gestures, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with spells or swords, but with careful preservation of evidence and stubborn refusal to let injustice be forgotten. As dawn light began filtering through the library windows, she closed the magical book for the final time and returned it to its hiding place. The preservation charms would ensure it remained accessible to future investigators while remaining invisible to those who would suppress its contents. Walking back to Gryffindor Tower through corridors that had witnessed decades of calculated cruelty disguised as necessary sacrifice, Hermione felt the weight of her secrets settling into a form she could carry indefinitely. She would protect Harry by not telling him what she had learned until he was ready to use that knowledge. She would protect Ron by not burdening him with truths that would destroy his faith in the adults who shaped his world. She would protect her parents by never revealing that their beloved daughter had become a keeper of secrets that could topple governments. In the common room, she found Harry and Ron engaged in a heated discussion about summer holiday plans, their faces bright with the uncomplicated excitement of 12-year-old boys anticipating freedom from schoolwork and adult supervision. "Hermione," Harry called when he saw her. "We were just talking about visiting Diagon Alley together before school starts. Maybe we could look at the new racing brooms, get ice cream at Florian Fortescue's." His voice was full of the innocent enthusiasm that Dumbledore was systematically destroying, though Harry would never recognize the manipulation for what it was. Each adventure, each crisis, each moment of joy followed by trauma, all of it was designed to shape him into someone who would eventually choose death as naturally as he now chose loyalty to his friends. But for this moment, for this conversation about ice cream and window shopping, Harry Potter was simply a child looking forward to summer holiday with his best friends. "That sounds wonderful," Hermione said, settling into a chair beside them and allowing herself to smile at their plans. "I'd love to spend time in Diagon Alley with you both." She would give him these moments, would help preserve every instance of uncomplicated happiness he could experience before the weight of his planned destiny began crushing his spirit in earnest, would be the friend who remembered his laughter, his curiosity, his dreams that extended beyond martyrdom. When the time came for Harry to face the choice between life and death, he would do so, knowing that someone had fought to preserve his right to choose freely. Someone had honored the memory of those who died before him. Someone had ensured that truth would survive even if he did not. It might not be enough to save him, but it would ensure that his sacrifice, if he chose to make it, would be made with knowledge rather than manufactured ignorance. As she listened to Harry and Ron debate the merits of different ice cream flavors, Hermione felt the memorial wall's preserved names settling into quiet acceptance in her heart. She had given them the only gift she could, the promise that they would not be forgotten, and the assurance that future victims would have choices their generation had been denied. The war between truth and necessity would continue long after she was gone, but it would no longer be fought solely on Dumbledore's terms, with his carefully managed sacrifices and strategic eliminations. She had lit a slow-burning fuse that would eventually expose him for what he truly was. And sometimes, patient vengeance was the most powerful magic of all. Outside the windows of Gryffindor Tower, the sun rose over Hogwarts Castle, illuminating stone corridors that held centuries of secrets in their shadows. In the restricted section of the library, a preserved evidence waited for future discovery. In the deepest chambers of the school, memorial walls honored the forgotten dead. And in the common room, 3 13-year-old children planned a summer that would be filled with friendship, laughter, and the precious illusion that the adults who claimed to love them could be trusted to keep them safe. Hermione Granger smiled and began helping them organize their plans, carrying her terrible knowledge like a blessing and a burden, protecting their innocence for as long as possible while ensuring that when it was finally lost, it would be replaced with truth rather than lies. The memorial was complete. The evidence was preserved. The future was as secure as she could make it. For now, that would have to be enough. What if Petunia Dursley left, Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep, at age 3, and Molly raised him as her 8th child? What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner to go back to the night Harry's parents died and found Dumbledore, already, watching what if Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts at age 60 and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control? What if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys on the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back? What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive and found dark magic that should never have been nearer to child? What if Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before Harry? What if Severus Snape took Harry the night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul? What if Victor Krum offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school at age 12 and Snape was the one who held the door open? What if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits came alive during Harry's trial and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother Augusta demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13 after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry, filed the day after Lily and James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine? Or a check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys? To the Ministry, what if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow? And every entry was about Dumbledore's demands. What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury? Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot. What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance? In third year, to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip, what if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free until Dumbledore came looking for him? At age 14, what if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore, and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the third task, and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the Room of Requirement for 5 years before Hogwarts? What if Winky, the house elf, testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch, Sr., knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along?